Yo, what's up everyone? It's Watch Harry, and today we're checking out Petunia filed 23 lawsuits against Dumbledore and forced Hogwarts board to strip his magic permanently. Drop a like if you're hyped. Subscribe for daily content. Let's get this story started. Chapter 1, the filing. The letter came on a Tuesday, which Petunia would later think was appropriate. Tuesdays had no romance to them. No one expected anything significant to happen on a Tuesday. The postman arrived at 7:30, Petunia was already dressed, Vernon was already eating, and Dudley was already complaining about something, the texture of his eggs, probably, or the fact that the television in his room had developed a faint flicker that nobody else could see. The morning was perfectly, suffocatingly ordinary. And then there was the envelope. It was not like the Hogwarts letters. Those had been thick cream parchment with green ink and a wax seal, and they had arrived in a quantity that still made Petunia's eye twitch when she thought about it, pouring through the letterbox, falling from the fireplace, dropped by owls in broad daylight in front of the neighbors. This envelope was thin, cream-colored in a different way, almost ivory, and the address on the front was written in a typeface so precise it looked mechanical. In the upper left corner, printed in small embossed letters the color of old bronze, were the words, Gringotts Bank, Office of Muggle Liaison, Continental Division. Petunia stood at the kitchen counter and looked at it for a very long time. Post? Vernon said, without looking up from his newspaper. Nothing for you, she said, and put everything else on the table and took the ivory envelope upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed, her side, the left side, the side where the lamp was better, and she opened it with a letter knife because she had never in her life opened an envelope by simply tearing it. The paper inside was one sheet, single-sided, dense with small print on the lower half and a brief formal paragraph at the top. She read the paragraph. Then she read it again. Then she set it down on the duvet, went to the window, looked at the garden for approximately 45 seconds, came back, and read it a third time. The paragraph said, in essence, the following, that Gringotts Bank, in its capacity as executor of the estate of one Lily Jane Potter née Evans, had become aware of a series of outstanding obligations and protections afforded to the designated Muggle guardian of Harry James Potter under Section 14, subsection 7 of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, 1692, amended 1847, amended again in 1943 in a footnote that almost nobody had ever read, and that said guardian had, to the bank's knowledge, never been formally informed of these rights, which was itself a violation of no fewer than 3 separate clauses in the Wizarding Guardian Compact of 1891 and which Gringotts, as executor, was now legally obligated to bring to her attention. At the bottom, in slightly larger type, was a name, Ragnarok, Senior Partner, Estate and Guardianship Division. And below that, a Muggle-accessible address in London, a telephone number, and a single handwritten line in a different ink, cramped and precise, we suggest you bring documentation. We suspect you already have some. Petunia read that last line 4 more times. Then she went to the wardrobe, pushed past Vernon's good suit, reached behind the shoebox that contained her mother's old photographs, and pulled out a cardboard accordion file that was held shut with a thick elastic band. She'd bought it at W. H. Smith in 1989. She had filled it slowly, carefully, over the years that followed, the way some people tend a garden, a little at a time, with patience, with the knowledge that it might never come to anything but that it was better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it. She sat back down on the bed and put the accordion file next to the Gringotts letter and looked at them both. All right, she said, to no one. She did not tell Vernon. This was not a decision she made so much as a recognition of the obvious. Vernon's response to anything involving the wizarding world existed on a narrow spectrum that ran from purple-faced fury to pale-faced terror with very little in between, and Petunia needed neither of those things right now. What she needed was to think clearly, and she thought most clearly alone. She rang the number on the letter from the telephone in the hallway, standing with her back to the kitchen door because Vernon was in there reading the financial section and she had no interest in performing this conversation for an audience. The phone rang twice and was answered by a voice that was clipped and efficient and did not sound remotely human but was trying. Gringotts Bank, Muggle liaison. You are speaking with Thornwick. How may I assist? My name is Petunia Dursley, she said. I received a letter this morning from a Ragnarok regarding the estate of Lily Potter. I'd like to make an appointment. A pause. The kind of pause that suggested something was being looked up very quickly. Mrs. Dursley. Yes. Mr. Ragnarok is available Thursday at 2 o'clock. The address, I have the address. Do you require directions from, I'll manage. Another pause. Very well. Thursday at 2. We ask that you bring documentation. Yes. She glanced at the accordion file, which she'd brought downstairs and tucked under her arm. I'll bring it. She hung up. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to Vernon turn a page. She thought about Lily. She tried not to do that often. It was like touching a bruise, or worse, like touching the place where a bruise used to be, because sometimes grief healed into something stranger and harder than the original wound. She thought about the last time she had seen her sister alive, which had been at their mother's funeral, which had not been a good occasion for either of them. She thought about the letter Dumbledore had left on the doorstep with the baby. She had that letter. It was in the accordion file. She'd kept it because she'd known, in the way that she knew things without being able to explain exactly how, that someday it might matter that she had it. Thursday arrived with the particular grey determination of English autumn, and Petunia took the train to London in a good wool coat and her second-best shoes, because her best shoes were for church and funerals and this was neither. She had the accordion file in a canvas tote bag because her good handbag wasn't large enough and she refused to look ridiculous with it sticking out under her arm on the tube. The address took her down a street she'd never noticed before, which was impressive given that she had walked past this stretch of road in Covent Garden at least a dozen times over the years. The building had a narrow facade and a brass plate beside the door that said GWB Consultancy Group in a font that suggested it had been there since before the concept of fonts existed. She pressed the buzzer. The door opened without anyone answering it. Inside, it did not look like a bank. It looked like a very serious law office in which the decorator had never quite abandoned a medieval fixation. The ceilings were high, the lighting was amber, and behind a long counter sat two figures who were unmistakably goblins, shorter than she'd imagined from Harry's descriptions, with long clever fingers and eyes like old coins, and expressions that suggested they had been professionally unimpressed by humans for approximately 6 centuries. One of them looked at her. Mrs. Dursley. Yes. Ragnarok will see you. Third door on the left. Petunia walked past the counter with her canvas tote bag and her good wool coat and did not let herself feel even slightly intimidated by any of it. She found the third door on the left, knocked twice, and went in. Ragnarok was smaller than the goblins at the counter, older, with a face like the surface of very old wood and hands that were folded on the desk with the precision of someone who wasted nothing, not even gestures. He looked at her with those gold dark eyes and something shifted in his expression, not warmth, exactly, but a species of respect that she suspected he did not distribute casually. Mrs. Dursley, he said. Sit down. She sat. She put the tote bag on her lap. You've read the letter, he said. Several times. Do you have questions about it? I have questions about everything, she said. But I'd rather you start by telling me what Section 14, subsection 7 actually says in full. The letter summarized it. I don't like summaries. Ragnarok looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into a drawer and produced a document that was clearly very old and very carefully preserved, set it on the desk, and began to read. Section 14, subsection 7 of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, as amended in 1847 and further footnoted in 1943, established that in any case where a magical ward was placed upon a Muggle dwelling for the protection of a magical minor, a ward that necessarily involved the Muggle inhabitant's home, property, and personal safety being affected by magical forces, the the Muggle inhabitant was considered a designated magical guardian under the law, regardless of whether they themselves had magical ability. This status conferred specific rights, including the right to full disclosure of any magical activities conducted on or near their property, the right to compensation for any material costs incurred as a result of said magical activities, the right to be consulted on any magical decisions materially affecting the minor in their care, and the right of legal recourse through the Wiesengemot in any case where these rights had been violated. The footnote added, almost as an aside, that these rights had never actually been exercised by any Muggle guardian in recorded history, which was apparently considered unremarkable by whoever wrote the footnote and which Petunia found absolutely remarkable in every possible way. When Ragnok finished reading, the room was quiet for a moment. "Why," Petunia said, "was I never told any of this?" "That," Ragnok said, "is an excellent question, and one that forms the basis of Gringotts' legal obligation to contact you." He set the document down. "The bank has been aware of this provision for some time. It became relevant to our interests as executor of your sister's estate when we conducted a routine audit of the Potter account and discovered that no notification had ever been made to you, not when the ward was placed, not when the boy was left in your care, not at any point in the intervening years." He paused. "The individual responsible for placing the ward and for the arrangements surrounding Harry Potter's guardianship is Albus Dumbledore." Petunia said nothing. She opened the tote bag and set the accordion file on the desk. "What is that?" Ragnok said. 17 years of documentation," she said. "Every letter, every incident, every unexplained event, every time something happened in or near my home that I was never warned about, consulted about, or compensated for. The letter that Dumbledore left on my doorstep when he left Harry there in the middle of the night without asking me. Notes I made after every visit from his staff. Records of damage to my property. A list of every time Harry was collected, returned, or visited by people from that world without my prior knowledge or consent." She looked at Ragnok steadily. "I kept it because I knew, sooner or later, someone would need to look at it." Ragnok looked at the accordion file. He looked at Petunia. He unfolded his hands. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, and there was something in his voice that was unmistakably close to satisfaction, "I believe we should discuss the wizarding legal system in some detail." They talked for 3 hours. By the time Petunia walked back out into the grey London afternoon, she had a legal notepad, goblin-sourced, sturdier than anything human-made, covered in her own precise handwriting, a copy of the relevant sections of wizarding law that Ragnok's assistant had produced, and the name and address of a solicitor. The solicitor's name was Edmund Crail. He was a squib, a word Petunia had encountered before in a context that made it sound like an insult, but which Ragnok used with the neutrality of a technical term, which meant he had been born into a magical family, had no magic of his own, and had consequently spent 30 years becoming arguably the most knowledgeable person in Britain on the intersection of Muggle and wizarding law, occupying a professional space that neither world entirely acknowledged and that had made him, in Ragnok's words, irritating to everyone in exactly the right ways. She rang him from the train home. He answered on the first ring, which she liked. "Crail. My name is Petunia Dursley. Ragnok at Gringotts gave me your number. I'm the Muggle guardian of Harry Potter and I believe I have grounds for significant legal action against Albus Dumbledore and possibly the Hogwarts Board of Governors." A pause. Shorter than the one at Gringotts, which suggested Crail was faster on the uptake than the average goblin receptionist. "Significant," he said, "meaning what, exactly?" "I have documentation spanning 17 years, she said. "I believe I have grounds for at minimum 15 separate violations of the Wizarding Guardian Compact, 8 breaches of Section 14 of the Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, for counts of magical trespass, and several things that I think have other names in your legal system that I haven't learned yet." Another pause. This one had a different quality to it, the quality of someone doing arithmetic very fast. "Mrs. Dursley," Edmund Crail said, "I think we should meet in person." "I can do Monday," she said. "I can do Monday." "Good. She watched the suburbs slide past the train window. "I'll bring the file," she told Vernon on Saturday evening, after Dudley had gone to his friend Mark's house, because Dudley's presence tended to amplify Vernon's reactions in ways that were not useful. She sat him down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and explained, in short clear sentences, what she was doing and why. Vernon went through several colors. He settled, eventually, on a dark unhappy red that was at least not the purple of genuine fury. "You want to sue?" he started. "Yes. A wizard, yes. In a wizarding court, the Wizengamot." "Yes. Petunia." He set down his teacup. "Petunia, you know I have always, the neighbors, if anyone were to find out that we were involved with that lot, no one in this neighborhood reads the Daily Prophet," she said. "And I'm not doing this for visibility, Vernon. I'm doing this because it's right, and because I have the means to do it, and because someone should have done it a long time ago." She looked at him. "I am not asking for your permission. I am informing you as a courtesy because you live in this house and you deserve to know." Vernon looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes without expression. "Will it be dangerous?" he said finally. "I'm going to a courtroom, not a battlefield." "But those people," she said, "have been operating under the assumption that I am ignorant and powerless and that there are no consequences for what they've done. I intend to correct that assumption." Vernon picked up his teacup, looked into it, set it back down. "And the boy?" he said. "Harry?" "This is partly for Harry," she said. And then, because Vernon was looking at her with an expression she didn't entirely like, she added, "It is also for Lily. And it is for me." "That is allowed." Vernon didn't say anything else. She took that as the closest thing to support she was going to get and moved on. Edmund Crail's office was in a building in Holborn that looked, from the outside, like a perfectly ordinary Georgian terrace. Inside, it was roughly twice the size it should have been, which Petunia chose not to think too hard about, and lined floor to ceiling on two walls with legal texts that ranged from the perfectly mundane to volumes with titles like Bletchmore's Compendium of Invisible Contracts and a treatise on the binding properties of ancient oaths, Volume 3 of 9. Crail himself was a thin man in his late 50s with grey hair cut short and a way of going very still when he was thinking that put Petunia in mind of a heron watching water. He wore Muggle suits well and had the kind of face that did not give information away without deciding to. She liked him immediately and said nothing about it. He went through the accordion file in 90 minutes. He read without commenting, except that occasionally he would make a small sound, not quite a word, that landed somewhere between satisfaction and outrage. He made notes on a yellow legal pad that was covered in a shorthand Petunia couldn't read. When he finished, he squared the papers, set them back in the file, closed it, and looked at her. "You have 23 viable claims," he said. She had counted 19. "Tell me the other 4. He did. 2 of them were things she'd documented but not known the legal name for. One was a violation she hadn't considered from the right angle. The 4th was something she hadn't documented directly but which Crail said could be inferred from 3 other pieces of evidence she did have, and which he walked her through with the patient precision of a man who genuinely enjoyed this kind of argument. "The strongest cases," he said, when they were through, "are the ones relating to informed consent, specifically the ward placement and the letter Dumbledore left on your doorstep. The fact that you were never informed of the nature of the protection placed on your home, never consulted, never given the option to refuse, is a clear violation of Section 14 as well as the Guardian Compact. Those alone, if we argued nothing else, would likely result in significant financial damages and a formal censure." He paused. However, she agreed. "You are not here for damages. No. You want the Hogwarts Board of Governors involved." "Yes." Crail tapped his pen against the legal pad. "The board has jurisdiction over Dumbledore in his capacity as headmaster. If we can establish a pattern, not just individual violations, but a sustained and willful disregard for Muggle rights over the course of 17 years, on behalf of the institution he leads, we can make an argument that his conduct reflects on his fitness to hold that position. Furthermore, he paused again. The board has the power, under very specific circumstances, to recommend a magical forfeiture. Petunia looked at him steadily. That's permanent. It's irreversible, he said. It requires a 2/3 majority of the Wisengamot following a successful board recommendation, and the grounds have to be exceptional. We're talking about sustained, documented abuse of the law by one of its most powerful figures. He looked at the accordion file. But if anything in recorded wizarding legal history constitutes exceptional grounds, Mrs. Dursley, this does. Petunia was quiet for a moment. She thought about the baby on the doorstep. She thought about the cupboard under the stairs that she had known, every single day for 10 years, was wrong, and had done nothing about because the fear of the other world was larger than the guilt. She thought about Lily's eyes in Harry's face. I want to file, she said. All 23. Crail looked at her. All at once? All at once. He almost smiled. The ministry is going to have a very bad day. Yes, she said. That's the point. She did not tell Harry. Not yet. He was at Hogwarts, 16, in his 6th year, and whatever was happening there was clearly enormous and terrible, and she had pieced together enough from 3 years of Dumbledore's occasional, infuriatingly vague correspondence with herself to understand that the situation with the Dark Wizard was deteriorating. Harry had enough to carry. She would not add this to it until she had something concrete to show him. What she did instead was prepare. She spent 2 weeks going through the accordion file with Crail, building each of the 23 cases with the same methodical care she brought to everything, cleaning, organizing, arranging, which people had always read as smallness and which was, she was beginning to understand, actually a form of precision that most people never bothered to develop. She cross-referenced her notes with the legal documents Crail provided. She annotated. She reread the letter Dumbledore had left on the doorstep so many times she could have recited it. I am sure you will do what is right by your nephew. He must be kept safe above all else. I trust you to understand the importance of this without further explanation. No further explanation. That was the thing that she came back to, again and again. He had trusted her to understand without bothering to explain. He had left a baby on a doorstep in the middle of the November night and walked away because he trusted that she would manage, that the woman who had always managed would simply manage this too, without complaint, without support, without information, without rights. She had been furious about it for 17 years without knowing she was allowed to be. The Ministry of Magic's Muggle Liaison Office occupied a floor of the building accessible via a red telephone box in a Westminster side street, which Petunia discovered from Crail and which she found, frankly, undignified for a major governmental institution. She dressed for the occasion in her best coat, the church and funerals one, and a pair of shoes that were comfortable enough for standing her ground. Crail met her outside. He was carrying a briefcase that was fatter than her accordion file and a look of professional calm that she suspected concealed significant anticipation. Ready, he said. I've been ready for 17 years, she said, which was not quite true in the literal sense and entirely true in every other sense. They went in through the telephone box, which Crail instructed her was how Muggle visitors accessed the building. Petunia stepped inside, found it slightly cramped with both of them, and fixed her attention on the experience of descending through the floor with the composed expression of a woman who had once sat through a Ministry of Magic owl arriving through her kitchen window at 5 in the morning and had simply made a note of the time and cleaned up the feathers. This was not significantly stranger than anything else. The atrium was more impressive than she'd expected. She noticed that several people noticed her, a Muggle woman in a wool coat with a man she presumably recognized as Crail, who was not, she gathered, a particularly beloved figure in this space, and she met every glance with the flat calm of someone who was used to being looked at and had decided some time ago that other people's opinions of her appearance were their problem. The Muggle Liaison Office was on the 3rd floor. A junior official, young, faintly alarmed to see them, ushered them into a waiting room and went to find someone senior. The someone senior arrived in the form of a man called Perkins, middle-aged, with the look of someone who had been comfortable in this role for a long time and was now experiencing something he hadn't been comfortable enough to prepare for. He sat down across from them at a small table and said, with the careful cheer of someone who had never previously encountered a situation like this one, "Mrs. Dursley. What can we do for you today?" Crail opened the briefcase and placed a stack of documents on the table. "We are filing 23 separate legal claims," he said, in the tone of a man reading a shopping list, against Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, under sections 14, 16, and 22 of the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, the Wizarding Guardian Compact of 1891, the Magical Property and Trespass Act of 1947, and several subclauses of the Hogwarts Board of Governors Charter relating to institutional accountability. We are also filing a formal petition with the Board of Governors requesting an emergency review of the headmaster's fitness for office. He pushed the stack across the table. "We'll need time-stamped receipts for each filing." Perkins stared at the stack of documents. He looked at Petunia. He looked at Crail. He looked back at Petunia. "These are," he started. "Numbered and tabbed," Petunia said. 1 through 23. "The Board of Governors petition is on the top, in the red folder." Yes, I can see, but Mrs. Dursley, perhaps if you explained, the documents explain everything," she said. "That's what documents are for." Perkins picked up the first filing with the expression of a man who has reached into a coat pocket expecting his keys and found a live animal. He read the first paragraph. He turned pale in a way that was somewhat gratifying and mostly informative. He set it down. "I'll need to contact the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement," he said. "That would be appropriate," Crail said pleasantly. And Dumbledore will need to be notified." "Yes," Crail said. "Standard procedure. We've already sent a copy to Hogwarts by Owl this morning." He glanced at his watch. "He's had it for about 4 hours." Perkins looked at them both with the expression of a man who had answered a routine knock at the door and found something he was entirely unprepared for. Petunia sat with her hands folded on the table and looked back at him with the patience of someone who had been waiting to do this for a very long time and was now, finally, simply doing it. "The time stamps, please," she said. "When you're ready." They were back on the street outside the telephone box by 2:30 in the afternoon. The grey October light had not improved while they were inside. Petunia stood on the pavement and breathed the cold London air and felt something she hadn't felt in years, perhaps something she had never felt before with this particular quality, this specific clarity. "Well," Crail said, standing beside her. "Well," she agreed. "That went as expected. Better than expected." She adjusted the strap of the tote bag on her shoulder. "He looked like he was going to be sick." "He might be," Crail said. "When word reaches Dumbledore's people, and it will reach them today, probably within the hour, the Ministry is going to discover that it has a problem it has no precedent for." He paused. "They will attempt to make it go away quietly." "They will not succeed," she said. "No," he agreed. "They will not." He looked at her. "Dumbledore will want to meet with you." She had expected this. "I know. My advice, don't tell him I'm filing more," she said. "I know. We don't show the full scope until we're in front of the Wizengamot." She looked down the street, at the grey ordinary London afternoon. "I've been underestimated my entire life, Mr. Crail. I know how to let people keep doing it until it's too late for them to stop." Crail looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "Quite," he said. "I'll be in touch tomorrow." She walked to the Tube. She bought a cup of tea from a stand near the station because her hands were cold and she had earned it. She sat on a plastic seat on the Circle line with her tea and her tote bag and the time-stamped receipts in a new folder inside it, 23 claims, all accepted, all filed, all officially in the system now and impossible to quietly unmake. She thought about Dumbledore reading the notification owl this morning. She wondered what his face had looked like. She wondered if he had, for even a moment, taken her seriously. Probably not yet. That was fine. He would. The train moved through the dark tunnel and Petunia Dursley drank her tea and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like herself, not the self she performed for Vernon or the neighbors or the world, but the real one underneath, the one who had watched and waited and written everything down, the one who had turned out to be, against all expectation, precisely the right kind of dangerous. She would be home before Vernon got in from work. She would make dinner. She would water the front garden because the dahlias still needed it even in autumn. She would do all the things she always did, in the house that had always been hers even when it felt like a cage, and tomorrow Edmund Crail would ring, and the day after that the ministry would make their first attempt to suppress the filings, and the day after that she would be ready for them. She got off at her stop, walked up to the street, and went home. Chapter 2, The Solicitor's Gambit. The ministry's first move came faster than Crail had predicted. Not the next day. That same evening. Petunia was in the kitchen making shepherd's pie when the doorbell rang with the particular authority of someone who expected to be let in immediately. She wiped her hands on a cloth, walked to the door, and opened it to find two wizards on her doorstep, both in suits that were slightly wrong in the way wizarding attempts at Muggle clothing always were, one of them holding a small leather wallet that he flipped open to show her a badge with Ministry of Magic, Department of Magical Law Enforcement printed in gold on the inside. Mrs. Dursley, the badge one said. His name was apparently Williamson. He was tall with a long face and the slightly strained expression of someone who had been handed an assignment he didn't want. "I wonder if we might come in." "No," she said. Williamson blinked. "I beg your pardon. You haven't been invited." She looked at the badge, then at him. "Is this an official visit? Because if it is, you should have a formal notification of intent from the department head, which you would have sent by owl and which I have not received. And if it's unofficial, then there's no reason whatsoever I should let you into my home." The second wizard, shorter, rounder, looking deeply uncomfortable, glanced at Williamson. Williamson glanced back. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, with the careful patience of a man trying a different approach, "we simply want to discuss the filings you made today." "There are some procedural concerns, I'm sure there are," she said. "You can discuss them with my solicitor. Edmund Crail. His office is in Holborn. He'll be available from 9 tomorrow morning." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan, she'd been expecting something like this since the tube ride home, and produced a business card, which she held out. Williamson took it with the slightly stunned expression of a man who had knocked on what he expected to be a perfectly manageable door and found it was a wall. "Good evening." She closed the door. She stood in the hallway for a moment, listening. She heard them on the doorstep for about 30 seconds, quiet voices, a low exchange she couldn't make out, and then the sound of footsteps going away. She went back to the shepherd's pie. Vernon came in 20 minutes later through the back. "There are two men sitting in a car across the street," he said, pulling off his coat. "Ministry officials," she said. "Watching the house." "Watching the, Petunia, watching the house. What on earth? It means we're doing exactly the right thing." She checked the oven. "Dinner in 20 minutes. Don't open the door to anyone tonight." Crail rang at 8:30. "They came to the house," she said, before he could speak. "I know. They rang me as well. Left a message. Very polite. Very insistent." She could hear him moving in his office, papers shifting. "They want the filings withdrawn. Specifically Lawsuit 7 and Lawsuit 12, which are the two most directly damaging to Dumbledore personally, the ward placement consent claim and the letter." A pause. "They framed it as a procedural issue. Said those two filings may have been submitted incorrectly to the wrong departmental division." "Were they?" Absolutely not. I checked 4 times. His voice had the quality of someone who had been insulted by something they found insufficiently creative. It's a delay tactic. If we agree to refile them, we lose our current timestamps, which matter because there's a 60-day window on the Guardian Compact claims. They want to push us past it. Petunia thought about this. What happens if we don't refile? Then they have to process them as is, which they will do as slowly as humanly, or magically, possible while simultaneously trying to find some other angle. He paused. I expect we'll have a formal counter-response from the ministry within 3 to 4 days. Some grounds for dismissal. Probably something technical. And we respond to that? With the rest of the documentation they haven't seen yet, yes. She heard him settle into a chair. Mrs. Dursley, I want to be direct with you about something. The ministry will not simply process these claims. Dumbledore has been the de facto head of the wizarding establishment in this country for 30 years. He is on the Wisengamot. He controls the Hogwarts Board of Governors in every practical sense, even though he is nominally subject to them. He has friends everywhere. A beat. The legal case is airtight. The political case is going to be a war of attrition. Good, she said. I'm very good at attrition. She met Crail at his office on Wednesday morning to go through the ministry's likely objections, and she was there when an owl arrived through his third-floor window, a very large, very imperious bird that landed on the desk with the look of something that had been sent by someone important and knew it. It dropped a roll of parchment and left without waiting for a reply. Crail unrolled it. Read it. His face did the thing it did when he was containing a reaction. He passed it across the desk to Petunia. It was from Dumbledore. Handwritten, in the familiar looping green ink that she associated with Hogwarts correspondence, though the tone was different from those letters, more personal, more measured, and more carefully constructed than anything he'd sent before. It said, in essence, that he would very much appreciate the opportunity to meet with her to discuss her concerns, that he understood her position, that he wished to make amends where amends were due, and that he believed many of the misunderstandings that had led to this situation could be resolved in direct conversation. He expressed deep respect for the difficulty of her role as Harry's guardian. He expressed hope that they might find a path forward that served everyone's best interests, especially Harry's. It was an excellent letter. It would have been, Petunia thought, genuinely moving if she hadn't been aware that it had been sent the morning after 2 of his ministry allies tried to get into her house without an invitation. She set it down. He wants to meet. Yes. He thinks he can talk me out of it. He thinks he can talk anyone out of anything, Crail said. He's been right about that for roughly 60 years. She looked at the letter again. I'll meet him. Crail looked up sharply. I'd advise, I know. She folded the letter. I'm going to meet him anyway. Not because I think he'll change my mind. Because I want to see how he operates in person when he's worried. That's useful information. She put the letter in her bag. And because I have a few things to say to him that I'd like him to hear directly. Crail studied her for a moment. You understand he will be attempting to deploy every interpersonal skill he has. And he has considerable ones. Yes, she said. So do I. Nobody's ever bothered to notice, but I do. The meeting happened on Friday, at a neutral location Crail insisted upon, a private room in a Muggle hotel near Paddington that Dumbledore presumably accessed through some method Petunia decided not to speculate about. She arrived 7 minutes early. She arranged herself in the chair that faced the door, ordered a pot of tea, and was pouring her second cup when he walked in. She had seen Albus Dumbledore once before, in person, at the far end of a street when she was 9 years old and he had come to her parents' house to tell them about Lily. She had watched through the curtains and seen a very tall man with silver hair. The impression she'd retained was of enormous scale, not just physical, but something else, some quality of presence that made the space he occupied feel different from the space around him. He was older now. More white than silver, and he moved with the careful patience of someone who had learned not to waste physical effort. He wore what appeared to be a very deliberate attempt at Muggle dress, a pale blue suit that was almost correct, and his eyes over the half-moon spectacles were exactly as she'd expected from Harry's descriptions, very blue, very bright, very intelligent, and currently assessing her with a care that told her he had done his homework. "Mrs. Dursley," he said, sitting down across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Tea?" she said. He looked at the pot. "Yes, thank you." She poured. She let him take the cup, settle, arrange himself. She gave him the silence he was accustomed to filling. "I imagine," he said, "that this meeting is long overdue." "Yes," she said. "It is. I want to begin by saying, and I mean this sincerely, that I recognize the burden you have carried." He held the teacup with both hands. "Taking in Harry was not a small thing, and you were not given the support or explanation you deserved. That was a failure on my part, and I am sorry for it. It was a very good apology. It was specific enough to feel real, broad enough to cover a lot of ground, and delivered with the quiet conviction of someone who had spent 60 years being believed." Petunia watched him give it and felt nothing shift. That was not cruelty. That was simply the fact that an apology delivered in the context of 23 active lawsuits had a limited range of possible motivations. "I appreciate that," she said. "However." Dumbledore looked at her. "However," she continued, "an apology speaks to intent. What I've filed speaks to pattern. Those are different things." She set down her own cup. "I don't think you're a bad man, Professor Dumbledore. I think you are a man who made a series of decisions affecting my life, my home, and my family's safety without once consulting me, because it genuinely never occurred to you that you should. And I think that's worth examining in a legal context regardless of your intentions." He was quiet for a moment. "You are," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been genuine and might have been tactical and was probably both, a great deal more formidable than I gave you credit for. "Yes," she said simply. "You are not the first person to discover that. The lawsuits will proceed. Mrs. Dursley, I want to be honest with you about something." He leaned forward slightly. "The situation with Voldemort, with Harry, is reaching a critical point. Harry needs stability. He needs to know that the people in his life are not at war with each other. If this goes to the Wizengamot, the publicity alone could what?" she said. "Embarrass you? Or genuinely harm Harry?" He paused. "Because those are different things," she said. "And I think you need to be honest with yourself about which one concerns you more." Something happened in his face then. It was subtle, a fraction of a degree of shift, the way ice looks just before it cracks. She had hit something real. "I do not want Harry hurt," he said quietly. "Neither do I," she said. "I have never wanted Harry hurt. That is why I'm doing this." She looked at him directly. "Everything that has happened to Harry, the neglect, the isolation, the lack of preparation for what he is, all of it traces back to decisions made by people who thought they knew best without ever asking anyone's permission. Including me." She paused. "I am not blameless. I know that. But the choices that were made for both of us, without asking us, those consequences are yours to answer for." Dumbledore looked at her for a long time. His teacup was untouched in front of him. "If I were to make a formal offer," he said carefully, "of compensation, full disclosure, and a restructuring of the Hogwarts safeguarding, then I would direct you to Mr. Crail," she said, "because offers of settlement go through my solicitor. That is what solicitors are for." She stood, picking up her bag. "I am not unreasonable, Professor. I am not doing this for revenge, although I understand why it might look that way. I am doing it because what happened should not be allowed to have happened without consequence, and because if the wizarding legal system has the tools to create consequence, I intend to use them." She looked down at him. You left a baby on my doorstep without asking me. You put a magical ward on my home without telling me. You made me responsible for a child's safety in a war I didn't understand and never explained, and you trusted that I would simply cope, because I have always simply coped. And I did. But coping is not the same as consenting. She picked up her coat. I'll see you at the Wiesengemot, Professor. She walked out. In the corridor, out of sight of the room, she stopped for exactly 2 seconds, enough to let the slight trembling in her hand settle. Not fear. The after effect of adrenaline and precision. She had said exactly what she meant to say, in exactly the order she'd planned to say it, and she had watched it land. She walked on. She told Harry on Saturday. He was home for the weekend, a concession Dumbledore had apparently made in response to the filings, sending him back to Privet Drive early under the guise of holiday planning, which Petunia suspected was actually an attempt to put Harry in her physical space in hopes that proximity to the boy would make her hesitate. It was a reasonable theory. It was not correct. Harry came in Friday evening, thin and tired in the way he always was when school was difficult, which was always. Vernon made himself scarce. He'd developed a talent for disappearing whenever Harry came home, which suited everyone. Dudley was still at university, which simplified matters considerably. Harry sat at the kitchen table and ate the dinner she put in front of him and asked, because he had always been direct in the way that she hadn't ever known how to be until recently, "Is something happening?" It felt weird being sent home. She sat down across from him. She had thought about how to do this on the train, in the garden, in the dark after Vernon fell asleep. She had decided that the only way to do it was directly, the way she wished someone had been direct with her 17 years ago. "I've filed 23 lawsuits against Dumbledore," she said. Harry put his fork down. She told him everything. Not the legal detail, that was Crail's territory, but the shape of it, the Gringotts letter, Section 14, the Guardian Compact, Ragnarok, Crail, the accordion file, the ministry visit, the meeting with Dumbledore. She told it steadily and in order, and she watched Harry's face move through several expressions she didn't entirely have names for. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. "You've been keeping a file," Harry said. "Since 1989. Yes. Of everything. Everything I could document, yes." Harry looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked up at her. His eyes were Lily's eyes, and she had learned, over 17 years of seeing them across this table, to look at them without flinching. "Why?" he said. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. "Because I knew it was wrong," she said. "What was happening to you? What was happening to me? And I didn't do anything about it when I should have, and I am sorry for that. But I had this." She nodded toward the other room where the accordion file sat in the bureau drawer. "And when I understood that I had a way to do something with it, I did." Harry was quiet for another moment. "He's going to think you're doing this to hurt him." "Dumbledore." "I know." "Are you?" She thought about it, which was the honest thing to do. "I am doing it because it is right," she said. "If it hurts him, that is a consequence of what he did, not a goal of mine." A pause. "But I won't pretend I don't find a certain satisfaction in the idea that he will have to answer for this. Because I do." Something that was almost a smile crossed Harry's face. It startled her, that almost smile, because it transformed him briefly into someone she didn't entirely recognize, older and sharper and a little dangerous. "Okay," he said. "Okay? I mean," he picked his fork back up, "I mean yes." "Okay. Good." He ate a forkful of shepherd's pie. "What can I do?" She looked at him. "Nothing yet. When the time comes, if we need testimony, Crail will explain what's involved and you can decide." "I'll testify," he said immediately. "Don't decide yet. Think about it. Aunt Petunia." He looked at her steadily. I've been thinking about it since the day I was old enough to understand what normal people's childhoods looked like. He paused. I'll testify. She nodded once. She didn't say anything else because there was nothing to say that wouldn't undo the precision of the moment, and she had learned, eventually, that some moments were better left clean. The ministry's formal counter-response arrived by Ministry Owl Monday morning, not through the window this time, because she'd left a note for Crail to intercept official wizarding correspondence at his address. He rang her at 9:15. They've filed a motion to dismiss, he said, on the grounds that the Guardian Compact of 1891 was superseded by the International Statute Revision of 1945, which they claim made the compact obsolete as a standalone legal instrument. Did it? Absolutely not. She could hear him pulling out documents. The 1945 revision addressed international jurisdictional matters. It said nothing about the compact itself. They're hoping we haven't read the 1945 revision. A beat. I've read the 1945 revision. How long to respond? 10 days to file our countermotion. I can do it in 5. He paused. But there's something else. The motion to dismiss was signed by 3 Wysengamacht justices. Petunia processed this. 3 of them signed together? Unusual, he said. Typically a single justice reviews motions at this stage. 3 signing together suggests coordination. Dumbledore's people. Almost certainly. A pause. Mrs. Dursley, I want to raise something with you. The Wysengamacht hearing, when it comes, and it will come, because I will make sure the motion to dismiss fails, it will be public. The wizarding press will cover it. The Daily Prophet in particular has a history of being influenced by ministry officials, and ministry officials are currently very unhappy with us. They'll run something negative, she said. They'll try to run something that makes you look like a vindictive muggle who doesn't understand the wizarding world. He was matter-of-fact about it. They'll also likely go after me, my background, my motivations, my qualifications. Do they have grounds for any of it? For mine? None that I'm aware of. For yours? He paused. They might dig. If there's anything in your past or in your treatment of Harry that they could use, there is, she said. Because honesty was the only strategy that worked over the long term, and she had always known this was going to have to be confronted. Harry's childhood was not, it wasn't what it should have been. The cupboard. The way Vernon, she stopped. Started again. It was not a kind home, Mr. Crail. I have to be able to answer for that. A long pause. That changes some things. I know. It doesn't destroy our case. The violations we filed are real regardless of how Harry was treated inside your home. But if the press gets to it first and frames it badly, then we address it first, she said. In my testimony, when the time comes. Before they can frame it as anything. She looked out the kitchen window at the front garden. I am not asking the Wysengamacht to judge me as a perfect guardian. I am asking them to judge Dumbledore for decisions that were his to answer for. Those are different subjects. But if they bring up the first subject, I will not hide from it. Crail was quiet for a moment. You're going to make a very compelling witness, he said. Yes, she said. I intend to. By the end of the second week, the ministry had made 4 separate attempts to slow the proceedings: the motion to dismiss, a request for extension of the filing review period, a claim that 2 of the lawsuits required translation into official wizarding statutory language before they could be processed. Crail described this one as insulting and refiled the relevant documents in 3 hours, and a visit to Crail's office from a very senior ministry official who had apparently suggested over tea that Crail might want to consider the long-term implications for his career of pursuing this particular case. Crail had responded by filing the notes of that conversation as supplementary evidence of ministerial interference in legal proceedings, which was itself a violation of the Wysengamacht's charter. That, Petunia said, when he told her, was beautifully done. "Thank you," he said, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had waited 30 years for exactly this kind of fight. "It adds a 24th claim, incidentally, if we want it." "Add it," she said. She was in the garden when she said it, cutting back the dahlias with her good secateur, the telephone pressed to her shoulder. The afternoon was pale and cold and the street was very quiet. Across the road, a small tabby cat was sitting on the wall in front of number 7 with the perfect stillness of an animal that had been sitting in one place for a long time. Petunia had noticed the cat before. Several times, over the past week. Always in approximately the same spot. Always watching the house with a slightly unsettling quality of attention. She looked at it. It looked back at her. She thought about what Harry had told her once, years ago, about his transfiguration teacher, a woman who could become a cat. "Mr. Crail," she said. "Add the 24th claim. I'll ring you tomorrow." She hung up. She looked at the cat. The cat looked at her. "You can come in for tea," she said, "or you can go back to Scotland and tell him what you've seen. But if you're going to continue sitting on that wall, I'm going to start making notes." The cat stood, stretched with elaborate unconcern, stepped down from the wall, and disappeared around the corner of the street. Petunia went back to her dahlias. She made a note of the time. The counter-motion against the ministry's dismissal attempt was filed on the 5th day, exactly as Crail had promised. It was 11 pages and cited 47 separate precedents, the most obscure of which dated from 1623 and the most recent from 1989. Crail delivered it to the Wisengamot clerk's office in person and returned to Holborn looking quietly pleased with himself. "The motion to dismiss is dead," he said, when he rang Petunia. "The clerk told me, off the record, you understand, that the 3 justices who signed it have been asking questions about the scope of the filings. They didn't realize there were 24. "Good," she said. "There's also talk, and this is the part one want you to be prepared for, that the Hogwarts Board of Governors has been notified by the Wisengamot clerk as per the standard procedure when a petition for institutional review is live. Some of the board members are not Dumbledore's people." A pause. "Some of them have been waiting for an opportunity like this for a long time." Something settled into place in Petunia's understanding of the landscape, a shift like the last piece of a jigsaw finding its position. "Tell me about them." Crail told her. 3 board members, a woman named Augusta Longbottom, a merchant named Gareth Selwyn who had spent 5 years trying to get accountability reforms through the board and been blocked every time, and a retired orar called Headley Moss, had apparently been consistently outvoted on matters of Hogwarts governance for the better part of a decade. They were not Dumbledore's enemies in any dramatic sense. They were simply people who believed in institutional accountability and had been made impotent by an institution that didn't. "They'll want to talk to me," Petunia said. "Almost certainly." "Set it up," she said. "But not until after the counter-motion clears. I want the legal ground solid before we start building the board strategy." "You're thinking 3 or 4 steps ahead," Crail said. "I've had 17 years to think about this," she said. "Now I'm just executing." He laughed, a short, real laugh. She didn't hear him laugh often. "The hearing date will be set within the next 2 weeks, he said. "The Wisengamot has a calendar conflict in November but December is clear." He paused. "Mrs. Dursley. Are you ready for what that hearing is going to be like?" She thought about the ministry official who'd shown up at her door. The cat on the wall. The 3 justices who thought 47 legal precedents could simply be ignored. The newspaper story that was undoubtedly being composed somewhere in an office she'd never see. The weight of an institution that had never lost, had never been asked to lose, had never conceived of a world in which someone like her could make it lose. "I've been ready," she said, "since a very old man left a baby on my doorstep and walked away without knocking." She hung up the phone. She stood in the kitchen of the house she had lived in for 20 years, the house that had been a refuge and a trap and a stage and a home all at once, and she thought about Lily, and she thought about Harry, and she thought about the accordion file sitting in the bureau drawer that she had started filling when Harry was 2 years old, because some part of her, the quiet watchful part that nobody ever thought to ask about, had always known that someday someone was going to have to account for all of this. And that the someone was going to be her. Chapter 3, The Wizengamot. The hearing was set for December 11th, Crail told her on a Thursday, and Petunia wrote it in her diary in the same handwriting she used for dentist appointments and Dudley's university parents' evenings, precise, unhurried, committed to the page. She underlined it once. Not twice. Once was enough. She spent the 2 weeks before it in Crail's office every other day, going through the testimony structure, the order of the claims, the likely lines of questioning from the Wizengamot justices. Crail had obtained the seating chart, 37 justices for this session, which he said was high attendance and meant the hearing had already attracted significant internal attention. He knew the leanings of 22 of them with confidence, was uncertain about 9, and considered 6 genuinely unpredictable. Unpredictable how? She asked. They're principled, he said, as though this were a complicating condition. They'll follow the law wherever it leads. That's good for us on the legal merits and potentially complicated on the political ones. He spread the seating chart across his desk. The chief warlock for this session is Tiberius Ogden. He's old establishment, been on the Wizengamot for 40 years, personal friend of Dumbledore's, but he's also genuinely punctilious about procedure. He will not let this become a spectacle if he can help it. Good, she said. I don't want a spectacle. I want a verdict. The press is going to make it a spectacle regardless. The Daily Prophet had run its first story 6 days earlier. Petunia had read it at Crail's office, he'd obtained a copy through a contact, and found it about what she'd expected. The headline was Muggle Woman Launches Unprecedented Attack on Hogwarts Headmaster, and the story positioned her as misguided, naive, and almost certainly being manipulated by unspecified parties with agendas against the wizarding establishment. It mentioned Edmund Crail's name with the specific quality of insinuation that stopped just short of direct accusation. It quoted an unnamed ministry official who called the lawsuits a fundamental misunderstanding of how wizarding law operates and a troubling example of Muggle interference in magical governance. It did not quote Petunia. It did not contact her for comment. It did not mention the content of any of the 24 claims. They didn't read the filings, she said. They read them, Crail said. They chose not to write about what's in them. That's worse, she said. Yes. She read the story a second time, then set it down. She was not angry in the way she might have been once, the hot, helpless anger of someone who had no recourse. This was different. This was the cold clarity of someone who knew exactly where the recourse was and was already walking toward it. Can we get our own statement out? She asked. Crail hesitated. The wizarding press is largely, not the wizarding press. The Squib community has publications. And there are Muggle-born families. Parents. Guardians. People who've been in exactly my position. She looked at him. If there's a way to reach them before the hearing, we should. Crail looked at her with the expression he got when she said something he hadn't thought of. It was becoming a familiar look. I know a journalist, he said. She writes for the Quibbler, which is eccentric, she said. Harry's mentioned it. Fine. Who else? There's a network, he said slowly, as though assembling the idea as he spoke. Squib rights organizations. Muggle-born advocacy groups. Some of them have been pushing for exactly this kind of accountability reform for years and have never had a case strong enough to hang it on. Then they should know about this one, she said. Before December 11th. Crail made several notes. She watched him and thought about the 3 board members, Longbottom, Selwyn, Moss, whom she'd met in a conference room in Diagon Alley the previous week. Augusta Longbottom had turned out to be a formidable woman in a hat with a stuffed vulture on it, which was either eccentric or a deliberate choice to be underestimated. Petunia suspected the latter. They'd talked for 2 hours. Augusta had asked pointed questions, listened to the answers with complete attention, and at the end said, "Young woman, I have been trying to get accountability measures through that board for 11 years. Tell me what you need." It had been, Petunia thought, one of the better conversations of her adult life. December 11th was cold and gray and absolutely determined to be significant. Petunia wore her black coat, not the church and funerals one, the one she'd bought for herself 6 years ago that fit properly and didn't carry any associations, and her best shoes, and she arrived at the ministry telephone box at 8:45 for a 9 o'clock start. Crail was already there, briefcase in hand, looking like a man who had been awake since 5. Harry was with her. She'd brought him because he had asked, again, and because she thought he should see it. Harry was 17 now, taller than she'd fully registered until he was standing beside her in the lift, wearing what appeared to be the nicest Muggle clothes he owned, which were not very nice. She made a note to take him shopping and then remembered that the world was slightly on fire and shelved it for later. "You all right?" he said. "Perfectly," she said. He gave her a sideways look, evaluating, the same way he evaluated most things now, with a careful quiet intelligence that she recognized because it was familiar. Because it was Lily. "You look, I don't know. Calm." "I am calm," she said. "Shouldn't you be nervous?" "Being nervous doesn't improve outcomes," she said. "Preparation improves outcomes. I've prepared." Harry thought about this as the lift descended. "Right," he said. "Yeah, okay." The Wizengamot courtroom was nothing like a Muggle courtroom and everything like one. The ceilings were very high, the walls were dark stone, and the seating was arranged in tiered semicircles around a central floor where 2 chairs faced the judicial bench. The bench was elevated, 7 senior justices sat there, with Chief Warlock Ogden in the center. The full Wizengamot was ranged in the tiers. 39, she counted, not 37. 2 additions since the seating chart. The gallery was packed. She had not fully anticipated the gallery. It ran along both sides above the tiered seating and was full of people, witches and wizards who had apparently come specifically to watch this, which meant either that news of the hearing had spread further than the Daily Prophet's dismissive little article, or that the wizarding world was more starved for accountability than even Crail had suggested. She walked in beside Crail, Harry a step behind, and felt the shift in the room the moment they entered, the collective intake of something, attention or recognition or surprise or all 3. She looked straight ahead. She found the table set in the center of the floor, in front of the justice's bench. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked up at Chief Warlock Ogden and waited. Dumbledore was already in the room. He was seated in the respondent's chair to the left, with a ministry solicitor beside him, a woman named Pharaoh who Crail had described as competent and cautious. Dumbledore looked, Petunia thought, exactly as he always looked. Composed. Wise. Serene in the way that very confident people could be serene, wearing their certainty like armor. He met her eyes across the courtroom. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, enough to register that she had seen him, and then turned her attention to the bench. Ogden called the session to order at 9:15, late by 15 minutes, which she logged as information. He was a broad man with a gray beard and the formal gravity of someone who took the ceremony of this room seriously, which she respected. He read the case citations in full, all 24, and she watched the room process the number. 24. There was a murmur at it. She had expected that. Pharaoh, for the defense, rose and made a preliminary argument. It was procedural, careful, and well-constructed, the claim that the Guardian Compact had been effectively superseded, the argument that Dumbledore's actions had been taken in extraordinary circumstances and in the best interests of the wizarding world, the suggestion that the Muggle claimant, while sincere, was operating from an incomplete understanding of wizarding law. It was exactly the argument Crail had predicted, delivered well. Petunia listened without expression. Crail rose. He was quieter than Pharaoh, less theatrical, more precise. He dismantled the supersession argument in 4 minutes using the 1945 revision itself, reading the specific language that Pharaoh's argument depended on and demonstrating, clause by clause, that it said nothing of the kind. He did it without looking at his notes more than twice. He then briefly outlined the 24 claims in order, not for the room's entertainment but for the record, and requested that the bench allow the full evidentiary presentation to begin. Ogden granted it. The morning session ran through the first 6 claims. Crail was methodical. Each claim followed the same structure: the legal basis, the specific documented event, the evidence, the resulting harm. He presented it the way you'd build a wall, one brick solidly placed before the next went on top of it. Claim 1, failure to disclose ward placement. Crail read the letter Dumbledore had left on the doorstep, the entire text, including the sentence about trusting her to understand without explanation. He then read the specific language from Section 14 requiring full disclosure to any Muggle resident whose property was affected by a magical ward. He set the 2 texts side by side and let the justices read them. Claim 2, failure to obtain consent. Shorter. The law required consent before ward placement on a Muggle property. There was no record of consent being sought or given. There was no mechanism by which Petunia Dursley could have consented to anything, because she was never told there was anything to consent to. Claim 3, failure to inform the guardian of the nature of the threat to the ward's person. For this one, Crail called his first witness, a ministry records official who confirmed, under procedural obligation to be truthful, that no formal threat assessment had ever been provided to Petunia Dursley at any point during the period of Harry Potter's guardianship. Pharaoh objected. The circumstances were extraordinary, she said. The threat was unprecedented. Ogden allowed the objection for discussion. 3 justices from the tier asked questions. Crail answered each one directly, citing the specific clause that explicitly addressed extraordinary circumstances and explicitly stated that they did not exempt the responsible party from notification requirements. Petunia watched the 3 justices listen. 2 of them, she thought, were genuinely tracking the argument. One was not, but not in a hostile way, in the way of someone whose mind was made up before the session started and was waiting for it to end. She filed that away. Claim 4 was the one Crail had called the most emotionally resonant, which was saying something given the company. It was the claim related to the Hogwarts letters, specifically, the manner in which Harry Potter had been denied access to his own correspondence, at Dumbledore's instruction, without Petunia's prior knowledge that Dumbledore's instruction was the reason. This required Crail to enter into evidence a piece of documentation that Petunia had not expected to be available, an internal Hogwarts Owlpost record showing that 11 letters had been sent to Harry Potter at his registered address before the escalating method of delivery had been authorized by Dumbledore personally. The record had been obtained through Gringotts executor rights, the bank had access to certain Hogwarts records relating to the Potter estate, and the Owlpost records from 1991 fell within scope. The room was very quiet when Crail read the date of Dumbledore's authorization. He had personally approved the escalating delivery on the morning after the first letter went unanswered. He had known from day one. He had said nothing to Petunia. Pharaoh rose. The respondent's intent was to ensure Harry Potter received his Hogwarts letter in circumstances. My client's intent, Crail said, pleasantly, is not under dispute in Claim 4. The notification requirement is. He looked at the bench. Mrs. Dursley was not informed that letters were being sent to her home, and she was not informed that when those letters did not reach their addressee, Dumbledore had authorized an escalating delivery program that culminated in several hundred letters arriving through every available entrance to her property simultaneously. That program was carried out on her property without her knowledge or consent and caused material distress to the household. He paused. The only question in Claim 4 is whether the statute required notification. It did. You're describing the situation with the letters, then, said one of the justices in the second tier, a woman with sharp eyes, Justice Marchbanks, who Crail had described as principled and excellent. Several hundred letters arriving through every entrance. Through the letterbox, the fireplace, the windows, and at one point through the front door when it was opened, Crail said. My client documented it at the time. We have the notes. Justice Marchbanks looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore's expression had not changed. He was watching the proceedings with the air of a man who had decided to be patient. But his hands, Petunia noted, were folded on the arms of the chair with slightly more precision than before. She was good at noticing hands. Claims 5 and 6 were shorter and both strong. By the end of the morning session, Petunia could feel the atmosphere in the room had changed, not decisively, not yet, but the way a room changes when the argument that was supposed to be ridiculous turns out not to be. The quality of silence in the gallery had shifted. The murmuring between justices in the upper tiers had a different tone. Ogden called lunch recess at 12:30. Harry had been sitting in the gallery. She found him in the corridor outside, standing with a cup of tea someone had apparently given him, looking slightly stunned. Is it always like that? He said. I wouldn't know. This is my first time. You were so, he stopped. Started again. You sat there the whole time like you were watching television. I was paying attention. I know. That's what I mean. You were paying complete attention to everything and you looked completely, he searched for the word. Settled. She had been nervous, actually, in the very first minutes, before Crail started speaking, not visibly nervous, because she had spent 42 years mastering the performance of composure, but nervous in the private way, the controlled breathing way. It had passed almost immediately when the proceedings began, because proceedings were concrete and concrete things she could work with. Go and eat something, she told Harry. There's a cafe at the end of the hall. What about you? I'm meeting the board members. Augusta Longbottom was already waiting in a side room with Gareth Selwyn and Headley Moss. Petunia sat down with a cup of tea she didn't particularly need and listened while Augusta told her what she'd observed from the gallery. She had been there for the morning session, watching, with the focused attention of someone assembling information. Marchbanks is with you, Augusta said. And Tofty, which I didn't expect. He's old school but he's not corrupt, he'll follow the argument if the argument holds. She glanced at Selwyn. Carmichael in the upper tier is a problem. He was at school with Dumbledore. How many do we need? Petunia said. For the board petition to trigger, which is separate from the hearing findings, we need a simple majority to rule in your favor on the substantive claims. That gets us the right to bring the board petition to a full board vote. Selwyn had a neat, precise way of speaking that matched his neat, precise appearance. For a forfeiture recommendation from the board itself, we need 5 of 9 board members. You have 3, she said. We have 3 who are committed, Moss said. He was a big, quiet man with the manner of someone who chose his words after careful selection. We have 2 more who are sympathetic. Whether sympathy becomes a vote depends on what the Wisengamot produces. Then we need a strong afternoon session, Petunia said. How strong is the afternoon? Augusta asked. Petunia thought of Claim 7, the ward placement consent claim, the one the ministry had tried to have dismissed. She thought of Claim 12, the letter, and everything the letter said about Dumbledore's relationship to her autonomy. She thought of the documentation Crail had saved for the afternoon that she had not seen released yet, that even the ministry's lawyers didn't fully know about. Strong enough, she said. The afternoon session changed the room. Claim 7 was heard first. The ward placement consent claim was technically the most complex of the 24, but Crail had built it so clearly that complexity became clarity in the presentation. He walked the justices through the specific nature of the Privet Drive ward, the blood protection, the way it tied to Petunia's continued residence, the fact that her daily choice to remain in the house was itself a magical act under the terms of the ward, a continuous renewing of a protection she had never been told she was making. That landed. She saw it land. Justice Marchbanks went very still. 2 justices in the third tier exchanged a look. The implication was specific and extraordinary, that Petunia Dursley had been, for 17 years, an involuntary participant in a magical ritual, because that was the precise legal category a blood ward fell under, without her knowledge or consent. That every morning she woke up in that house, she had been performing magic by proxy, feeding a ward that protected not just Harry but Dumbledore's strategy, Dumbledore's war, without so much as being told it was happening. Farrow objected. The blood ward was protective. The intent was Harry's safety. Crail agreed that the intent was Harry's safety. He then asked Farrow, pleasantly, to point to the specific clause in any piece of wizarding law that allowed the intent of safety to override the requirement for consent in an involuntary magical ritual. Farrow could not. Ogden wrote something on the paper in front of him. Claim 8. 9. 10. Each one built on the last. The progression was cumulative, not just in legal weight but in human reality, because Crail had structured them so that the story they told was not abstract but specific. A specific woman. A specific house. A specific set of decisions made by a specific powerful man who had never once in 17 years picked up a telephone. Then Claim 12. Crail read the letter. The full text, again, as he had in the morning for Claim 1, but this time in the context of everything that had been established since. After 6 claims in the morning and 5 in the afternoon, the room had been educated. The justices knew, now, the legal weight of what a designated Muggle guardian was under the law. They knew what Section 14 required. They knew what the Guardian Compact said. Reading the letter now, I am sure you will do what is right by your nephew. I trust you to understand the importance of this without further explanation. In the context of everything the law required Dumbledore to have done and had not done, was a completely different experience than reading it cold. The gallery was very quiet. Petunia looked straight ahead. Ogden said, slowly, the respondent left this letter on the claimant's doorstep. Yes, Crail said. In the early hours of the morning. The 1st of November, 1981. Harry Potter was 15 months old. A long silence. And there was no other communication. No formal communication of any kind until the claimant contacted the respondent's office in 1992 regarding Harry Potter's Hogwarts attendance. Another silence. The claimant contacted the respondent, Ogden said. Not the other way around. Correct. Ogden looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore met his gaze. His face was composed and calm, and something else that Petunia was close enough to read, something behind the composure that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it. The recognition, she thought, of someone watching the ground they've always stood on being shown to be less solid than they believed. Farrow rose for the rebuttal. She made the best argument the situation allowed: extraordinary times, extraordinary measures, Dumbledore's singular role in the war against Voldemort, the specific danger to Harry and by extension to anyone who knew the full details of his location. She was articulate and persuasive and clearly believed what she was saying. Then Ogden did something Petunia had not expected. He turned to her. Mrs. Dursley, he said. Do you wish to make a personal statement for the record at this time? She looked at Crail. He gave a single small nod. She stood. She had not prepared a speech. She had specifically decided not to prepare a speech because prepared speeches became performances and she was done performing. She stood at the table with her hands at her sides and looked at the bench. I want to be clear about one thing, she said. I am not disputing that Harry needed to be protected. I am not disputing that the wizarding world faced a genuine and terrible threat. I understand that decisions were made quickly, under extraordinary pressure, by people who were trying to protect a child. She paused. What I am saying is that I was that child's guardian. I was the person who fed him, who took him to the doctor, who stood in a school corridor while his teachers told me things about him that I didn't know how to interpret because nobody had ever explained what he was. I was the person responsible for him, legally and practically, and nobody, not once, not in 17 years, told me what that responsibility actually consisted of under your law, or gave me the information I needed to fulfill it properly, or asked me if I was willing to carry it. She looked at the bench steadily. That is not a failure of extraordinary circumstances. That is a pattern. And a pattern that long, maintained by someone with as much access to the relevant law as Albus Dumbledore, is not an oversight. It is a choice. The room was completely silent. She sat down. Ogden called the end of the afternoon session 40 minutes later. The vote on the first 12 claims would be tallied over the following week. The remaining 12 would be heard in a second session, currently set for January. But as Petunia stood and gathered her papers, she could already count. She had been counting since Claim 7. She watched the justices file out and she noted who spoke to whom in the upper tier, who made eye contact with Ogden, who looked at Dumbledore and who conspicuously did not. Outside, in the corridor, Harry fell into step beside her. The statement, he said. Yes. At the end. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She waited. He had a way of assembling what he needed to say that took a beat longer than most people, and she had learned not to rush it. You said you took me to the doctor, he said. I did. And the teacher's telling you things. Yes. Was that, he stopped. Was that hard? She thought about the specific quality of hardness it had been. Standing in the corridor of his primary school while the teacher explained about the incident with the glass and the telekinesis, and Petunia standing there knowing exactly what it was and having no way to address it, no resources, no support, no one to call. The specific loneliness of that. Yes, she said. It was. Harry nodded. He didn't say anything else. She didn't either. They walked out of the ministry together into the cold December afternoon, and the silence between them was not the silence of people who don't know what to say but the silence of people who have said, for now, enough. Crail rang at 7 that evening. She was at home, cooking, Harry eating toast at the kitchen table. I've been talking to contacts, Crail said, without preamble. The vote count. Tell me. On the first 12 claims, based on the justices I can read, and some of this is estimation, I think we win between 6 and 8. Definitively. 6 to 8 out of 12. More than half. And the board? If we win 8, Selwyn thinks he can get a 5th vote for the board petition. A pause. There's something else. Dumbledore's side reached out to me this evening. She turned off the hob. Settlement offer? Better than the last one, he said. Full acknowledgement of the violations in claims 1 through 6. Financial compensation. A formal restructuring of Muggle Guardian notification procedures going forward. A pause. And the headmaster position. He's offering to step down from Hogwarts. The kitchen was very quiet. Harry, who had heard nothing but her side of the conversation, was looking at her with the focused attention she recognized. He steps down, she said. But keeps his magic. Yes. She picked up the wooden spoon from the counter. The violations in claims 7 through 24? Not acknowledged. Then no, she said. I anticipated that. I told them we'd respond formally tomorrow. Crail was quiet for a moment. You understand that refusing this puts us in significantly harder territory. The remaining 12 claims are strong but more complex. The forfeiture proceedings, if we get to them, will be contested aggressively. And Dumbledore, freed from the constraint of wanting to settle quietly, may start fighting in ways he hasn't yet. He should have thought of that, she said, in 1981. Crail made the sound he made when he was suppressing satisfaction. Tomorrow, then, he said. I'll draft the formal rejection. She put the phone down. She turned the hob back on. Harry was still looking at her. He offered to step down, she said. From Hogwarts. In exchange for the charges being reduced. Harry was quiet for a moment. And you said no. I said no. Good, he said. Quietly, certainly. Then, Aunt Petunia. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. For all of it. For keeping the file. He stopped and looked at the table. She would have, Mum would have, he stopped again. His jaw was set in the way it got when he was holding something in. I know, she said, which was all that needed saying. Eat your toast. It's going cold. She turned back to the hob and she did not let him see her face for a moment, because some things were private, and because she was Petunia Evans and she had always managed, and she was going to keep managing. Right up until the day she was finished. Chapter 4, The Counterattack. The Daily Prophet story ran on a Thursday. Petunia read it at Creel's office, standing at his desk while he sat across from her with his hands folded and the expression of someone who had expected this and was not going to pretend otherwise. The headline was, Muggle Guardian's Dark Past, What Petunia Dursley Isn't Telling the Wizengamot. Below it, a photograph of number 4, Privet Drive taken from the street, which meant someone had been on her road with a camera at some point in the last week. The story was careful in the way that genuinely dangerous stories were careful. It made no claims it couldn't technically defend, it used words like sources suggest and questions have been raised and neighbors describe, and it assembled a picture of Petunia Dursley that was not entirely untrue and not remotely complete. It mentioned the cupboard under the stairs. It mentioned Harry's primary school attendance records, which she had no idea how they'd obtained. It quoted an unnamed neighbor who described the household as always a bit cold and never quite right with that boy. It mentioned, in a parenthetical that was designed to look like an afterthought but wasn't, that Edmund Crale had twice been refused membership in the British Magical Solicitors Association on grounds the story declined to specify. She set it down. They've been busy. 2 days, I'd estimate, Crale said. This much sourcing in 2 days means they had people working on it before the hearing. Before the hearing. She looked at him. Dumbledore's office. Or the ministry. Or both. They prepared this in advance and waited for a trigger. He picked up the paper and read a paragraph in the middle. The Solicitors Association rejection is the most interesting part. It's technically accurate. I was rejected twice, in 1987 and 1991, and entirely misleading, because the association's membership committee was, in both those years, chaired by people with direct professional ties to wizarding families I had represented in adverse proceedings. He set it down. It's designed to suggest I'm professionally dubious without providing anything to argue with. Can we respond? I've already drafted a letter to the Prophet. His tone indicated clearly what he thought the probability of publication was. More usefully, I've drafted a response for the Quibbler and the Squib Rights Digest, both of which will actually run it. He paused. There's also something else. I had a call this morning from a journalist, wizarding, not Muggle, named Rita Skeeter. She wants to interview you. Petunia knew the name. Harry had mentioned it with a specific quality of wariness. No. My instinct too. She writes for the Prophet freelance. Then absolutely not. Agreed. He pulled a different sheet of paper forward. The formal vote results from the first session came through this morning. The Wizengamot ruled on all 12 claims. She sat down. Tell me. We won 9, he said. She had expected 8. Which ones did we lose? Claims 3, 8, and 11. 3 and 11 were the notification claims relating to the specific timing of Dumbledore's ward maintenance visits. The justices found that the evidence of the visits themselves was insufficient to establish a pattern, which I think we can reframe in the second session with supplementary documentation. He set the paper down. Claim 8 we lost on intent grounds. Carmichael wrote the dissent and it's essentially the extraordinary circumstances argument. We won't change his mind. 9 out of 12. The board petition? Crale allowed himself a small, precise smile. Selwyn confirmed this morning. He has his 5th vote. The Board of Governors vote was scheduled. 5 of 9 had agreed to bring the petition to a full session. The other 4, Dumbledore's remaining allies on the board, would fight it, but 5 was a majority and the session had to happen. She felt something firm and specific settle in her chest, the feeling of a mechanism engaging. When? Mid-January, pending the second Wisengamot session. The board can't vote on forfeiture until the Wisengamot completes its findings. He leaned back. Which means the second session is the critical one. The remaining 12 claims are more complex but most of them are stronger. If we win 8 of those, we present the Wisengamot's cumulative findings to the board, she said. A pattern of sustained, willful disregard. 20 wins out of 24 claims. If everything holds, yes. She nodded once. She thought about the Daily Prophet story, and the photograph of her house, and the unnamed neighbor who had described her household as cold. She thought about the specific kind of fight that had just been declared. They're going to go harder now, she said. Yes. What else should I expect? He counted on his fingers. Ministry officials visiting the house again, possibly more formally this time, possibly under some procedural guise. Pressure on Harry through Hogwarts, potentially, difficulties with classes, scheduling issues, something that brings him home or distracts him. Pressure on me through the Solicitors Association, as a preview of which has already appeared in print. Possibly someone approaching Vernon. She looked up sharply. Vernon. He's the easiest target in the household. He has no legal connection to the proceedings, no understanding of wizarding law, and strong opinions about anything that might draw public attention to his family. Crail's tone was measured and exact, not unkind. If someone reaches him before you do, and he makes a public statement, he won't, she said, with the certainty of 20 years of managing Vernon Dursley. I'll handle it tonight. She got home at 3 in the afternoon. Vernon's car was in the drive, which meant he'd left work early, which was unusual. She came in through the front door and found him in the sitting room with a cup of tea he'd apparently made himself, which he only did when he was either very pleased or very agitated. His color told her it was the latter. There was a card on the coffee table. White, ministry-quality paper, embossed gold lettering. She picked it up. Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic. A personal mobile number written in green ink underneath. He rang the office, Vernon said. My direct line. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between frightened and impressed, which was unusual enough that she gave it her full attention. A man from the ministry. Said the minister himself wanted to have a conversation. Said it was a courtesy call. Said, he stopped. He suggested that this whole business was going to cause a great deal of trouble, Petunia, and that reasonable people might find a reasonable solution before things became unmanageable. What did you say? Vernon looked at his teacup. I said I'd pass the message along. She put the card on the mantelpiece. Good. That's the right answer. She sat down across from him. Vernon. Look at me. He looked at her. No one is going to ring you again, she said. Because I am going to ring that number in approximately 20 minutes and explain, very clearly, that any further contact with members of this household that does not go through Edmund Crail will be added to the list of claims currently before the Wisengamot. And then I am going to ring Crail and tell him to draft the relevant documentation because it almost certainly qualifies as ministerial interference under the charter. She looked at her husband steadily. If anyone else contacts you about this, in person, by phone, by owl, by any other method, you say nothing except that they should contact my solicitor. Can you do that? Vernon opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. Petunia, he said. The Minister for Magic is worried, she said. Which means we're winning. Can you do what I asked? A long pause. Vernon looked at the card on the mantelpiece. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not agreement exactly, because Vernon's full agreement had never been the operational standard in this household, but something more like the resolution of a man who had recognized that the person across from him knew what they were doing. "Yes," he said. "All right." She rang the ministry number. She reached a secretary who was polished and evasive and tried to route her to a different department. She said, very pleasantly, that she was calling to inform Minister Fudge directly that his office's contact with Vernon Dursley at his place of work would be documented and submitted as supplementary evidence in the current Wisengamot proceedings if any further such contact occurred, and that her solicitor would be receiving a full briefing this evening. She asked the secretary to ensure that message reached the minister by close of business. The secretary was quiet for a moment and then said she would pass it along. "Thank you," Petunia said, and hung up. Vernon had been listening from the doorway. He looked at her with the expression he got sometimes, not often, but sometimes, that reminded her of why she had married him, which had partly been because he was solid and committed and incapable of deception. He was not a subtle man, but he was, in his way, loyal. "Are you all right?" he said. It was not the kind of question he asked often. She considered it seriously. "Yes," she said. "I'm better than all right." She stood. "What do you want for dinner?" Harry came home the following Friday. Dumbledore had sent him again, a second early return, ostensibly for a dental appointment that Petunia had not made and which Harry clearly knew nothing about. He arrived by night bus, which she gathered because he came in through the front door looking faintly green, and sat down at the kitchen table with the air of someone in need of a warm drink in a moment of stillness. She put the kettle on. She watched him settle. "Something's happening at school," he said. She turned from the counter. "Tell me." "Snape." He said the name with the specific compression of someone who has a great deal to say about a person and is choosing to say as little as possible. "He's been, difficult isn't even the right word. He called me into his office twice this week. Once about an assignment, which was fine, the assignment was fine, and once about something he called extracurricular distractions." Harry looked at the table. "He told me that certain concerns had been raised about my focus, and that perhaps family matters were becoming a distraction from my studies." Petunia set 2 cups on the counter. "He used the phrase family matters." "Yes." "And what did you say?" Harry's jaw did the thing. "I said my family matters were none of his business." A pause. He didn't like that. She poured the tea and set a cup in front of him. She sat down. "Harry. Has anything changed? With your classes, your marks, anything practical?" "No. Everything's fine academically. It's just," he turned the cup in his hands. "It feels like pressure. Like someone wants me to feel like I'm doing something wrong by being connected to this." He looked up at her. "Am I? Is this, should you not have?" "No," she said. It came out flat and certain, the way the truest things sometimes did. "Don't do that." I know what you're doing," she said. "You're taking other people's discomfort and deciding it means you've done something wrong. You've been doing that your entire life and it's not a habit worth keeping." She looked at him directly. "What I'm doing is right. The discomfort other people feel about it is information about them." Harry was quiet for a moment. Something relaxed slightly in his shoulders. "Snape's connected to Dumbledore," he said. "Everyone's connected to Dumbledore," she said. "That's rather the point." He almost smiled. "What do I do if he calls me in again?" "You go. You listen. You say nothing about the proceedings except that they are a matter between your guardian and the relevant parties and are handled by your solicitor. If he persists beyond that, you note the time and date and what was said and you tell me." "Note the time and date," Harry repeated. "Yes. You've been doing that my whole life, haven't you?" "Yes," she said. He looked at his tea. "I wish you'd told me." She thought about that, the honesty of it, the slight sting of it, which she took as fair. "I didn't know, for most of it, that I was doing something with purpose," she said. "I thought I was just coping." She paused. "I didn't know there were rights. I didn't know the law existed. I kept the file because it felt wrong and I needed to put the wrongness somewhere." She looked at him. "By the time I understood I could actually use it, you were 16. You could have told me at 16. "I did," she said. "The moment I had something concrete. I didn't tell you about the file while it was just a file." Harry thought about this for a moment. She let him think. "Okay," he said, eventually. "That's fair." They drank their tea. Outside, the December street was dark at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the dahlias had been cut back to stubs, and the front garden looked bare in the way that things looked bare right before they started over. The pressure campaign escalated precisely as Crail had predicted. The day after Harry went back to school, 3 ministry officials arrived at Privet Drive with a formal document claiming that the submission of Claim 19, which related to a specific incident in 1994 where Petunia's garden hedge had been partially destroyed by an apparition mishap involving ministry workers, required additional verification under Statute 48C of the Magical Property and Trespass Act, and that she would need to attend a verification meeting at the ministry within 5 working days or the claim would be administratively suspended. She read the document on the doorstep while the 3 officials stood in the cold. She noted that Statute 48C related to commercial property claims, not residential ones, which meant it was either incompetently drafted or deliberately misleading. She looked up at the 3 officials. "This statute applies to commercial properties," she said. "Number 4, Privet Drive is a residential dwelling. You've cited the wrong provision." The official who'd handed it to her, young, visibly uncomfortable, looked at his colleagues. "My solicitor will respond to the correct provision in writing," she said. "Good morning." She closed the door. She rang Crail. "I saw it coming," he said. "It's the 3rd attempt to get you physically into the ministry on their terms. They want you in a room where you're on their ground. What's the correct response?" "Formal written objection to the citation, counter-citing the correct residential provision, filed by end of business today." "I'll do it." A pause. "They'll try something else." Something else came 2 days later, via the Hogwarts Board of Governors, in the form of a letter to Augusta Longbottom claiming that the board petition had been improperly submitted because it had not received the counter-signature of the full board secretary within the required 72 hours of filing. Augusta rang Crail, who confirmed that the petition had been countersigned within 48 hours, and that the relevant board record showed it clearly. Augusta Longbottom's response to that letter, which Crail read to Petunia over the phone with audible appreciation, was 3 sentences long and included the phrase "I will not be trifled with on procedural matters by people who cannot read their own charter" and a request for formal clarification of who in the board secretary's office had raised the objection and under whose instruction. The objection was withdrawn the following morning. "She's magnificent," Crail said. "She is," Petunia agreed. "What's next?" What was next turned out to be the article. Not the Daily Prophet piece. That was, apparently, only the opening move. The second piece ran in a different publication, a Wizarding Society journal called Spellcraft and Society, and it was longer, more considered, and significantly more dangerous than the first because it was authored by someone with genuine academic credentials. The argument it made was this: that the Guardian Compact of 1891 had been designed with a specific context in mind, an era of far greater exposure between Muggle and Wizarding communities, and that applying it in the contemporary Wizarding world, where Muggle guardians were rare exceptions rather than the norm, was a category error. More than that allowing a Muggle to use the Guardian Compact as grounds for a forfeiture proceeding against one of the Wizarding world's most significant figures set a precedent that could be weaponized by hostile Muggles in ways the framers of the Compact never intended. It was, the article suggested, a threat to Wizarding sovereignty. It was the best argument the opposition had produced, and Petunia said so to Crail when he read it to her. "It's good," he agreed. It's wrong, but it's well constructed. The sovereignty argument is particularly designed to appeal to the section of the Wiesengemot that would rather not engage with the actual merits. How do we counter it? The obvious counter is textual. The compact doesn't restrict itself by era, and the 1943 amendment explicitly extended its application to contemporary contexts. But the effective counter is different. He paused. The effective counter is showing that the compact exists precisely for situations like this one, that the protection of Muggle guardians from magical institutional overreach is not a peripheral concern but a foundational one. That it's not weaponizable by hostile Muggles because it requires documented, specific violations, not general grievance. We show it in court, she said. In the second session. Yes. And there's something I want to use in the second session that I've been holding back. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Dursley. Have you ever met a woman named Arabella Figg? She knew the name from Harry. The neighbor in the next street, the one with all the cats and the smell of cabbage, who Harry had always been sent to when the Dursleys went out. She'd barely spoken to the woman directly. I know who she is. She's a squib, Crail said. She was placed on your street by Dumbledore. She's been watching your house, watching Harry specifically, for 15 years. And she has been, it turns out, keeping her own records. A pause that had genuine weight to it. She rang me last week. She read about the case in the Squib Rights Digest. She wants to testify. Petunia sat with that for a moment. Arabella Figg, in the next street, watching the house. Watching Harry. What kind of records? Detailed ones, Crail said quietly. She wrote down what she observed. Over 15 years. She wrote it down because, and I'm quoting her, because someone should, and I thought someday someone would need to know. The kitchen was very quiet. Petunia thought about a woman sitting in a house full of cats in the next street, writing things down for 15 years because it felt wrong and she needed to put the wrongness somewhere, and it occurred to her that she was not, had never been, as alone in this as she had believed. Use her, she said. The Ministry's fourth attempt was the most direct. It came on a Wednesday morning when Vernon was at work and Harry was at school and Petunia was alone in the house. The doorbell rang. She went to the door expecting nothing in particular and found Minerva McGonagall standing on the front step in full wizarding robes, which she had not bothered to disguise, which meant either she had forgotten or she didn't care, and Petunia suspected the latter. She had seen McGonagall once before, or once that she was aware of, because now she knew about the cat she thought she may have seen her several times without realizing. In person she was taller than the cat suggested, with a face that had been severe for so long it had ceased to be severity and become simply architecture. She was also, Petunia noticed, slightly uncomfortable, which was interesting. Professor McGonagall, Petunia said. Mrs. Dursley. A pause. May I come in? She considered this for exactly 1 second. McGonagall was not the Ministry. She was not Dumbledore, not technically, she served the institution, but Crail had been clear that she was not among the people coordinating the pressure campaign. And she had been watching the house as a cat last month, which meant she had seen enough to have something to say. Yes, she said. Come in. She took her through to the sitting room. She did not offer tea, because offering tea would make this social and it wasn't social. She sat down. McGonagall sat across from her, straight-backed, hands in her lap, wearing the expression of someone who had decided to do something and was doing it. I want to be clear that I'm not here at Dumbledore's instruction, McGonagall said. I assumed not, Petunia said. He'd have sent someone less direct. Something flickered in McGonagall's expression. Not quite amusement. Closest to acknowledgement. I came because, she stopped. Started again. I have been at Hogwarts for 37 years. I have known Albus Dumbledore for most of them. I believe he is a great man and I believe the things he has done for the wizarding world are real and significant. She held Petunia's gaze steadily. I also believe that the claims you have filed are substantially correct. The sitting room was very quiet. I watched this house, McGonagall said. For a night, before Albus left Harry here. I sat on that wall, she glanced toward the window, and I watched, and I knew, even then, that it wasn't right. That leaving a child on a doorstep without explanation, without consent, without support, was not right. Her jaw set. I said so. At the time. He didn't listen. Why are you telling me this? Petunia said. Because I thought you should know. A pause. And because I want to ask you something. Ask. The forfeiture. McGonagall looked at her hands briefly, then back up. If it proceeds, if the Wisengamot and the board complete the process, it is permanent. Irreversible. Albus Dumbledore would live the rest of his life without magic. She paused. He is an old man. He has done great harm in the ways you've described. He has also done great good in ways that are real. I'm not asking you to weigh one against the other because I don't think that's a scale you can balance. She looked at Petunia directly. I'm asking whether you've thought about what it means. Yes, Petunia said. I've thought about it. And it's not a punishment I've chosen, she said. It's a consequence that the law provides for the specific pattern of conduct I've documented. The Wisengamot and the board will determine whether the law applies. That's their function. She looked at McGonagall. I'm not standing in front of them asking them to hurt him. I'm standing in front of them asking them to take 24 violations of the law seriously because they are serious, and to apply the consequences that the law says apply. What those consequences are is not my decision. McGonagall was quiet for a long moment. You are not what I expected, she said. No, Petunia said. I rarely am. McGonagall looked at her, really looked, the way someone looked when they were reassessing everything. I testified to the cat surveillance in my diary, she said. I keep records of my surveillance deployments. Dates, times, observations. She paused. If Mr. Crail wanted access to those records, as an independent contemporaneous account of the circumstances of the night Harry was left here, I would make them available. Petunia looked at her. Why? Because the record should be complete, McGonagall said simply. Because what happened should be documented accurately, even if the documentation serves a case I find personally difficult. She rose, smoothing her robes. Because I told him it was wrong in 1981 and he didn't listen, and this is the only way I know to say it again. She walked to the door. Petunia walked with her. At the threshold, McGonagall turned. Harry, she said. He's doing well, academically. I know, Petunia said. He's become someone remarkable. Yes, Petunia said. He has. McGonagall nodded once, and left. Petunia stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she went inside and rang Crail. I have McGonagall's surveillance records, she said. And she'll make them available voluntarily. A pause that was longer than usual. That's, Mrs. Dursley, that is extraordinary. I know. She sat down at the kitchen table. Put them in the second session. With Fig. Understood. She could hear him writing. The opposition is running out of moves. Yes, she said. They are. She looked at the window. The street outside was ordinary and cold and bright, the kind of winter afternoon that had no drama in it, just light. But they're not out of moves yet. The second session is still 3 weeks away. Watch the board members. Longbottom's watching herself. Good. She paused. And Harry. Harry? Watch for anything coming at him from school. Snape was already laying groundwork. If they try to use him, we respond immediately. We respond before, she said. I want a letter to Snape's professional record filed tomorrow as a precautionary measure, noting that any interference with Harry Potter's academic experience in connection with current legal proceedings constitutes potential ministerial interference. Put it on record before he does anything else. A beat. You're thinking 4 steps ahead again. I'm thinking 2 steps ahead, she said. I just move faster than they expect. The letter to Snape's record was filed on Thursday. On Friday, Harry's defense against the dark arts professor, not Snape, sent a commendatory note about Harry's most recent practical examination that arrived at Privet Drive by Owl, which Petunia noted was either coincidental or a minor act of institutional positioning by someone who had read the room. Either way, she kept it. She put it in the accordion file. On Saturday, Vernon asked her, over breakfast, how it was going. Not with the anxious color of a man hoping it would go away, but with the careful attention of a man who had decided to understand something he had been avoiding. We have McGonagall's records, she said. A second witness. And the board session is confirmed. Vernon nodded slowly. He looked at his newspaper. He set it down. I always thought, he said, carefully, in the voice he used when he was trying to be honest about something uncomfortable, that you'd been, that with Harry, there were things I didn't. He stopped. I didn't help. She looked at him. He was looking at the table. No, she said. You didn't. He nodded. Still looking at the table. She let him sit with it because that was the right thing to do. Is there something I can do now? He said. For the case. Not for the case, she said. But there might be a time when I need you to be a consistent presence at the hearing. To sit in the gallery and be there. She paused. That would be useful. He looked up. I can do that, he said. All right, she said. Then that's what you do. She went back to her tea. Outside, the cat was not on the wall. The street was empty and clear and the morning light was coming in at a low angle that made everything precise and sharp-edged, the way winter light did when it was trying. 3 weeks until the second session. 3 weeks until Arabella Figg and Minerva McGonagall's records and claims 13 through 24, the ones Crail said were stronger, and the cumulative weight of everything they'd built. She was not afraid of 3 weeks. She had been doing the work for 17 years. 3 weeks was nothing. Chapter 5, The Testimony. The second session of the Wisengamot convened on a Tuesday in January. Petunia arrived 40 minutes early. Not because she was anxious, she had moved past anxious somewhere around the 3rd week of December when the ministry had run out of procedural delays and the board session had been formally confirmed, but because she wanted to see the room before it filled. She wanted to stand in it empty and feel the dimensions of it without the weight of 39 sets of eyes and the gallery packed to standing. She stood in the center of the stone floor and looked up at the tiered seating and the high bench and the dark walls and she thought, I am a woman from Covent Garden who kept a cardboard accordion file under a shoebox. I am 44 years old and I have never been in a courtroom in my life before this month. I am going to finish this today. Then she went and sat at her table and arranged her papers. Crail arrived 10 minutes later with his briefcase and a look of someone who had slept precisely as much as was functionally necessary and no more. He set the briefcase down, checked the arrangement of their documents, and sat. McGonagall's records are tabbed as Supplementary Exhibit 7, he said. Figg is confirmed for 11 o'clock. Harry's testimony is scheduled for after lunch if we need it, and I think we will. He paused. Are you ready? Yes, she said. The gallery is going to be fuller than last time. She had anticipated this. The first session's findings, 9 claims upheld, had apparently traveled through Wizarding Society with the velocity of something genuinely unprecedented. The Squib Rights Digest had run 3 articles. The Quibbler had published her formal statement in full with Luna Lovegood's father's editorial note calling it one of the most important legal documents produced in Wizarding Britain since the Goblin Accords. She did not entirely understand what the Goblin Accords were but Ragnarok, when she'd mentioned it, had looked satisfied in a way that suggested the comparison was apt. People arrived. The gallery filled. The tiered seating filled. Ogden took his place at the center of the high bench with the deliberate settled authority of a man for whom ceremony was function, and called the session to order at exactly 9 o'clock, which was 2 minutes earlier than last time. She logged it as information. He was taking this seriously. Farrow made the opening statement for the defense. It was different from the first session, less procedural, more substantive. She had recalibrated, which meant Dumbledore had recalibrated. The argument she made now acknowledged, for the first time, that some of the violations were real. She did not concede them legally, she framed them as regrettable oversights made in extraordinary wartime circumstances by a man who had borne extraordinary burdens. She was asking the Wizengamot not to exonerate Dumbledore but to contextualize him. It was, Petunia thought, a much smarter approach than everything that had come before. She watched the justices' faces while Farrow spoke. Some of them were receptive to it. Of course they were. The argument was good and the man it defended was someone most of them had known for decades. Crail let Farrow finish. He rose without looking at his notes. The defense has invited the Wizengamot to contextualize, he said. We agree that context is important. We intend to provide it. He started with Claim 13. It was, technically, about property damage, a specific incident in August of 1992 when members of a wizarding family had arrived at Privet Drive in a flying car, extracted Harry Potter from his second-floor bedroom window, and in doing so damaged the window frame, the exterior wall, and a section of guttering that had cost Vernon Dursley £240 to have repaired. No notification. No compensation. No acknowledgement of any kind. Petunia had the repair invoice. She had had the repair invoice for 12 years, in the accordion file, behind the tab marked property damage. It was not the most dramatic of the 24 claims. But Crail presented it first in the second session deliberately, because it was concrete and specific and completely undeniable, and because it reminded the Wizengamot, after Farrow's careful contextualization, that this was not a philosophical argument. This was a window frame and a section of guttering and a woman who had kept the invoice. Claims 14 and 15 were stronger. 14 was the Dementor incident, the use of Dementors in the vicinity of a Muggle residential area in the summer of 1995, again without notification, again without any explanation to the household, which had included Petunia, Vernon, and Dudley, all three of whom had experienced the effects of Dementor proximity without understanding what was happening to them. Crail read her notes from that night. She had written them the morning after, 2 full pages in her diary, the kind of writing she did when she needed to process something she couldn't explain. Dudley became distressed in a way I have never seen. I experienced something I can only describe as the absence of everything good I have ever felt, which lasted approximately 45 seconds and left me unable to stand for several minutes. Harry appeared to have been the target of whatever occurred. I do not know what Dementors are, but Harry said the word in a way that suggested I should. She had looked it up subsequently in the wizarding texts she had quietly obtained through Gringotts Muggle Resource Service. She had added the definition to her notes. Claim 14 was not about property damage. Claim 14 was about 3 Muggles being subjected to the effects of dark magical creatures in their own home without warning, consent, or subsequent explanation. It was about Dudley, who was 20 and at university and who had not, his mother knew, entirely recovered from whatever he had experienced that night. It was about Vernon, who had not slept properly for 2 weeks afterwards and had not known why. Ogden said nothing while Crail read the notes. Neither did the room. Petunia sat with her hands flat on the table and looked straight ahead and let the words do what they were supposed to do. Claim 15 was the memory modification inquiry. In 1994, Ministry officials had arrived at Privet Drive following a minor magical incident, Harry's hover charm incident with the pudding, years earlier, and had sent an official warning about underage magic use addressed to Harry at her home. The warning letter was in the file. What was also in the file, noted 3 days after the letter's arrival, was something slightly different, a visit from a ministry obliviator who had arrived at the house on what appeared to be a separate errand, a cover story about a gas inspection, and whom Petunia had noted in her diary as a man who looked at me strangely when I answered the door as though he expected someone else, or perhaps expected me not to remember something. She had not been sure, at the time, what it meant. Ragnarok had explained it when she brought it to his attention during their first meeting. The Obliviator's visit corresponded with a ministry record, which Gringotts had access to through the executor inquiry, showing a low-level memory modification order issued for residents of the property following the pudding incident. The order had been issued. The modification had apparently not been carried out successfully, because Petunia had a complete memory of the pudding incident and of the Obliviator's visit. But the order had been issued. The room, when Crail read the Gringotts obtained ministry record and placed it beside Petunia's diary note, went absolutely still. The ministry, Crail said, in the quiet reasonable voice he used when the evidence was sufficient, issued an order to modify the memory of a Muggle civilian who had committed no offense, in her own home, without legal grounds under any provision of the Memory and Mind Magic Regulation Act. This order was issued in connection with events occurring on Mrs. Dursley's property without her knowledge or consent. He paused. The fact that the modification was unsuccessful does not alter the fact that it was attempted. Pharaoh was on her feet immediately. The extraordinary circumstances argument. The protection of wizarding secrecy. Ogden let her make it and then asked, with the careful precision of a man who had been on the bench for 40 years, whether the defense was aware of any provision in the Memory and Mind Magic Regulation Act that exempted ministry officials from the requirement for legal grounds in civilian memory modification. Pharaoh was not aware of any such provision. Because there wasn't one. Ogden wrote something down. Petunia watched his hand move and felt the weight of the session shift. Arabella Figg arrived at 11 o'clock. She was smaller than Petunia had expected from the brief impression she'd always had of her, a small rounded woman in a coat that had been washed enough times to lose its original color, carrying a handbag that matched the coat in that regard. She moved with the careful determined pace of someone who had decided to do something and was going to do it completely. She sat in the witness chair and folded her hands and looked at the Wisengamot bench with the equanimity of a woman who had been overlooked for so long she had simply stopped being troubled by being looked at. Crail walked her through the background. Her name, her address, her status as a squib. The fact that she had been placed on Wisteria Walk by Dumbledore, she was matter-of-fact about it, not accusatory, to provide informal surveillance on Harry Potter and the Privet Drive household. The duration of the arrangement, 15 years. She had received no formal instructions beyond watch the boy and report anything concerning. She had received no payment. She had been asked to maintain her role as Harry's occasional caretaker as cover for her actual presence. During those 15 years, Crail said, you made records. I kept a diary, Figg said. I've kept one all my life, since I was a girl. I write down what I observe. And what did you observe, Mrs. Figg, in the course of 15 years of watching number 4, Privet Drive? Figg was quiet for a moment. She looked at the bench, not at the gallery, not at Dumbledore's side of the room. I observed a child, she said, who was not treated the way children are supposed to be treated. Crail let that sit for 3 seconds. Specifically. She described what she had seen. She was specific and undramatic about it, which made it land harder than drama would have. The boy who was always in the garden doing chores while the other child watched television. The birthday that came and went every year without observable celebration. The primary school years, when Harry had been dressed in clothes that were clearly not his, too large, worn at the knees, in a neighborhood where every other child was dressed in clothes that fit. The way he moved when he came to her house, the specific quality of relief she had observed in him, like a mechanism releasing. She was not performing. She was not embellishing. She was reading from the diary she held in her lap, the precise observations of a woman who had written things down for 15 years because she understood, in some wordless fundamental way, that she was watching something that should be witnessed. On the 23rd of July, 1988, she read, Harry Potter came to my house for the day. He was 8 years old. When I asked what he wanted for lunch, he looked at me as though I had asked a question he did not know how to answer. I made him a ham sandwich and he ate it very carefully, as though he was afraid it would be taken away. The gallery was absolutely quiet. On the 14th of March, 1991, she continued, I watched from my garden as Harry Potter swept the front path of number 4. He swept the same section of path 3 times. He was not looking at the path. He was looking at the Privet Drive letterboxes down the street. A pause. He was waiting for the post. I did not know until later what he was waiting for. She read for 20 minutes. She read from 1986 to 2001, which was the whole of the period she had lived on Wisteria Walk, and every entry was dated and specific and in the same handwriting, the handwriting of someone who wrote daily, who had made a practice of attention. When she finished, Farrow's cross-examination was brief and visibly uncomfortable. She established that Fig was a squib with no formal surveillance training, that her observations were personal impressions, that she had no direct knowledge of what happened inside number 4. No, Fig agreed. I only know what I could see. And you only saw, I only saw what was there to see, Fig said, with the placid certainty of someone who had lived next to something for 15 years and was not going to be talked out of knowing it. Farrow sat down. Ogden looked at the Fig diary. He looked at his colleagues on the bench. He looked, briefly, at Dumbledore. Then he looked at Crail. The supplementary exhibit, he said. You referenced a contemporaneous surveillance record from another source. Yes, Crail said. He produced the tab labeled Supplementary Exhibit 7. These are the diary records of Minerva McGonagall, Transfiguration Professor and Deputy Headmistress of Hogwarts, covering her surveillance deployment to Privet Drive on the 1st of November, 1981. They have been voluntarily submitted by Professor McGonagall for inclusion in these proceedings. The room responded to this in the specific way that rooms respond when something unexpected and significant lands in them, not loudly, but with a collective shift, a realignment of attention. Crail read the relevant entry. It was short, 1 night surveillance, 1 entry. But it was Minerva McGonagall's handwriting and Minerva McGonagall's words, and what it said was, I expressed my concerns to Albus that leaving the child on the doorstep of people who had not been consulted and had not consented was not right, and that the woman inside, Petunia Evans as was, deserved better than a note. He told me to trust him. I do trust him. But I should have pressed harder. I am writing this down so that I will not forget that I did not press hard enough. The last sentence hit the room like a stone hitting water. Farrow did not rise. The bench was very still. Ogden looked up from the page after a long moment. Professor McGonagall wrote this in 1981. The night of the 1st of November, 1981, Crail confirmed. Contemporaneous with the events in question. Ogden looked at Dumbledore for a long moment. Dumbledore met his gaze. His face was composed. But something in it, some quality of the certainty that had always been there, the bedrock assurance of a man who had been right for so long he had forgotten what wrong felt like, was no longer entirely solid. Harry testified after lunch. He sat in the chair with his hands on his knees and his back straight and looked at the bench with the direct attention of someone who had decided to be honest and was going to be honest completely, and Petunia watched from the table and felt something she did not have an exact name for, a compound of grief and pride and something else that was specific to watching a person you have known since they were an infant become fully, recognizably themselves. Crail walked him through it gently. Not because Harry was fragile, he was demonstrably not fragile, but because the structure of testimony required building, and Harry had a natural tendency to go straight to the point, which was useful but needed channeling. He described his childhood. He was matter-of-fact about it, in the way that people were matter-of-fact about things they had processed over a long time. The cupboard. The Dursley household dynamics. The Hogwarts letters. The first time he had understood that he was a wizard and what that understanding had been like, arriving not as a gift or a revelation but as an explanation, a thing that finally made sense of being different in a way he'd always known and never been allowed to name. He described what he knew, from his own experience, about the protection on the house. The Blood Ward. What Dumbledore had told him, when Dumbledore had finally told him, in Harry's 4th year. He explained it like it was a kindness, Harry said. Like the information was a gift he was giving me. But it was information about something that had been done to both of us without our knowledge, and I was 17 when I found out. 14, Crail said quietly. 14, Harry corrected himself. I was 14. He described what he knew about the Ministry's involvement. What he knew about the Dementor incident. He described Dudley's reaction with a specific grief that was about his cousin's suffering, not his own, which was the kind of thing that Petunia noticed because she noticed everything. Then Pharaoh cross-examined him. Petunia had been watching for this since Harry sat down, the angle Pharaoh would take, the way she would frame the questions. She found it in the first question Pharaoh asked, which was careful and measured and aimed precisely at the softest point. Mr. Potter, Pharaoh said. You've described your upbringing as difficult. Is it fair to say that the difficulties you experienced were primarily a result of decisions made by your Muggle guardians rather than anything the wizarding world did or failed to do? Harry looked at her. He was quiet for exactly long enough that the room registered the consideration. The decisions made in my house were partly my aunt's and partly my uncle's, he said. And those are being dealt with in other ways that are between us. But what made it possible for those decisions to become what they were, the isolation, the lack of support, the secrecy, the fact that my aunt had no information and no help and no rights and no way to ask for any of it, that came from the wizarding world. That came from Dumbledore. He paused. You can't put someone in an impossible position and then judge them for struggling in it. The gallery responded to that. Not loudly. Just a shift. Ogden let it settle. And your aunt, Pharaoh said, still carefully, has your full support in these proceedings. Yes. You don't feel that they are, in any way, an attempt to use the legal system as a weapon against someone who worked to protect you? Harry looked at her steadily. Professor Dumbledore did protect me, he said. He also made choices that hurt me and hurt my aunt and did it while believing so completely that he was right that he never noticed he was doing damage. Both of those things are true. A pause. My aunt is not using the legal system as a weapon. She's using it as what it is. A way to make things official. A way to say, this happened, this was wrong, and we are not going to pretend otherwise. He looked at the bench. I think that's what it's for. Pharaoh had no further questions. The afternoon session moved through claims 16 to 22 with the cumulative momentum of everything that had come before. Each one was shorter than its predecessor in the morning because the evidentiary ground had been established and the justices were tracking the pattern now, not just the individual incidents. The pattern was the point. The pattern was what made this forfeiture grounds and not just damages grounds. Crail presented claims 23 and 24 together. 23 was the ministerial interference claim, the contact with Vernon Dursley's workplace, the ministry officials at the door, the procedural harassment campaign. He presented it concisely, with documentation, and noted for the record that it had occurred during the course of these proceedings, which made it not merely a past violation but an active one. 24 was the Solicitors Association interference, the attempt to discredit Crail through the Daily Prophet article using technically accurate but contextually misleading information about his rejected membership applications, in the context of ongoing legal proceedings. Crail presented this one himself with the particular precision of a man who had been waiting 30 years to put something exactly like this on the record, and the two justices in the fourth tier who had seemed uncertain all session visibly settled into the argument. Ogden called a recess. The room took 45 minutes and Petunia sat in a side corridor with Crail and Harry and a cup of tea that had gone cold before she remembered to drink it. How many? She said. Crail looked at his notes. From the second session? I think we win between 9 and 11. He looked up. Combined with the first session's 9, we're looking at a total finding between 18 and 20 claims upheld, out of 24. Possibly more. 18 to 20 claims upheld out of 24, against the most powerful wizard in Britain, in a system that had never processed a case like this, by a Muggle woman with a cardboard accordion file. Harry was looking at his hands. He looked up at her. "How do you feel?" he said. "I feel like we need to hear the verdict," she said. He nodded. "Yeah. Me too." The Wizengamot deliberated for 3 hours. Petunia sat in the waiting corridor and did not pace, because pacing was performative and she had no audience for whom she needed to perform anything. She read through Crail's notes from the session. She thought about Arabella Figg's diary and the ham sandwich and the 8-year-old who hadn't known how to answer a simple question. She thought about McGonagall's handwriting, should have pressed harder. "I am writing this down so that I will not forget." She thought about Lily. Not the painful version, not the bruise, not the absence. The real version. Lily, who had been extraordinary and reckless and warm and absolutely certain of everything, who had loved people the way some people loved weather, completely and without reservation. Lily, who would have done this 20 years ago if she'd known the mechanism existed, who would have walked into the ministry at 21 and filed papers with the same focused fury that she brought to everything. Petunia had not been Lily. She had been Petunia, careful, controlled, afraid of the thing that had taken her sister away, channeling that fear into smallness and neatness and the performance of ordinary. But she had kept the file. She had always kept the file. Some part of her, the part that had grown up with Lily and knew, in the cellular way of someone who had watched a great deal of magic at close range, that the world was bigger than the one she was allowed to live in, that part had always known this day would come. The clerk appeared at the corridor door. "The Wizengamot is ready to reconvene." Ogden read the findings standing. This, Crail had told her, was significant. Judges read findings standing when the findings were substantial. They had won 19 of 24 claims. She heard the number and felt it settle into her like water into dry ground, clean and immediate and completely real. 19. Lost on claims 3, 8, 11, 15, and 20. 15 was the memory modification attempt, which had failed and which the justices had not been able to establish as a completed act under the relevant statute. The other 4 she had expected. 19 was more than Crail's best estimate. 19 was overwhelming. Ogden read each upheld finding individually, which took 17 minutes. He read them in the even, carrying voice of the bench, and the room listened with the quality of attention that people gave to things they knew would be discussed and argued about and referenced for years. When he finished, he set the paper down. "This bench finds," he said, "that the pattern of conduct demonstrated in the upheld claims constitutes sustained and willful disregard for the legal rights of a designated Muggle guardian under the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, the Wizarding Guardian Compact, and related provisions, over a period of 17 years. He paused. "This finding will be transmitted to the Hogwarts Board of Governors in accordance with the petition currently before that body, for their consideration of the respondent's fitness for office and any consequent recommendations under the institutional accountability provisions of the board charter." Dumbledore sat. He was still. He was composed. He was, for the first time in Petunia's observation of him, a man who looked like he was holding something together from the inside. Pharaoh was already requesting appeal timelines. Ogden granted the standard 30-day appeal window and adjourned the session. The room erupted. Not with hostility, nothing as simple as that. With sound. The release of 3 hours of deliberative silence. Harry was in the gallery. Petunia looked up and found him looking back at her, and his face was doing something she couldn't read at the distance, something complex, and she gave him a single nod and he gave one back. Augusta Longbottom appeared at her elbow from the gallery steps. She gripped Petunia's arm briefly with a hand that was strong and dry and exact. "Board session," she said. 2 weeks. I have the 5th vote. A beat. I have the 6th. Petunia looked at her. When did you get the 6th? This afternoon, Augusta said. Partway through the Potter boy's testimony. She looked at Petunia with the sharp eyes under the extraordinary hat. Well done. She moved on before Petunia could respond, which was the kind of thing Augusta Longbottom apparently did. Crail was beside her, gathering papers. 19, he said. Yes. I estimated 12 in the first conversation I ever had with you. She looked at him. No, you didn't. You said 23 viable claims. I said 23 viable claims. Privately, I estimated 12 wins. He closed the briefcase. I was wrong. Yes, she said. You were. He looked at her with the expression that had been becoming more familiar, the one that was reassessment and something like genuine respect. What are you thinking? He said. She was thinking about the board session in 2 weeks. She was thinking about the forfeiture proceeding and what it would require. She was thinking about Dumbledore, still sitting in the respondent's chair across the room, and what he was thinking in this moment, this specific moment after 19 claims upheld and a Wisengamot finding and the board petition proceeding and 30 years of the world as he understood it beginning to rearrange itself around a different center of gravity. She was thinking about what she was going to say to him when this was over. She had been thinking about that for a while. I'm thinking, she said, about what comes next. She picked up her coat. She walked to the courtroom doors. Harry was coming down from the gallery stairs and fell into step beside her without being asked, and they walked out of the ministry together into the January evening, cold and clear and completely ordinary, the kind of evening that had no sense of occasion at all. 19, Harry said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. She would have loved this, he said. My mum. She would have absolutely, she would have been, he stopped. He pressed his mouth together. He kept walking. Yes, Petunia said. She would have. They walked to the tube. The city went about its business around them, enormous and indifferent and utterly unaware that in a courtroom under a London street, a woman who had been invisible for 44 years had just made herself undeniably visible, and the world she'd been invisible to was never going to be quite the same configuration again. Petunia bought a cup of tea at the station. She held it in both hands in the warmth of it and stood on the platform and thought about nothing in particular, which was a thing she almost never allowed herself, and which felt, in this moment, exactly right. Chapter 6, The Stripping the Board of Governors session was held on a Friday. Not at the ministry, the board had its own chambers, which Petunia had not known about until Crail explained them. They were in a building off Diagon Alley that looked, from the outside, like an unremarkable Victorian administrative block and felt, from the inside, like the kind of place where important decisions had been made for a very long time by people who believed in the importance of the decisions they made. Dark wood paneling. High windows. A long table with 9 chairs on one side and a presentation area on the other. Portraits on the walls of previous board members, most of whom wore the expression of people who had spent a great deal of time sitting for portraits and found it appropriate. Augusta Longbottom was already there when Petunia arrived. She was at one end of the long table in a chair that she occupied with the completeness of someone who had been born to sit in exactly this kind of chair, her hat today featuring what appeared to be a taxidermied bird of prey, which Petunia had stopped questioning and started admiring. Beside her sat Gareth Selwyn, neat and precise. Hedley Moss was at the window, drinking coffee, looking out at the grey January street with the focused stillness of a man who thought best when looking at something uncomplicated. 3 more board members arrived in the next 10 minutes, the new additions, the 5th and 6th votes Augusta had obtained. Petunia observed them. A woman named Rosamerta Clearwater who ran the Hogwarts Parent Liaison Committee and had, Augusta had explained, been troubled for some time by issues of student welfare accountability that she'd never had the right vehicle to raise. A man named Bertram Aubrey, retired, who had been on the board longest of any current member and who had told Augusta, apparently, that he had simply been waiting for someone to give him a good enough reason. 6 of 9 before the session even opened. The remaining 3 arrived together, Dumbledore's people on the board, and they were visibly aware of the arithmetic before they sat down. They were not incompetent. They read rooms. They sat down at the far end of the table and arranged themselves with the careful composure of people who had already decided how to lose and were going to lose with dignity. Dumbledore was not present. This was procedurally correct. The board session was a deliberative body, not an adversarial hearing, and the respondent was not required to attend. Crail was not present either, for the same reason. This was the board's business. Petunia sat in the presentation area's chair as the petitioner and waited. The session was chaired by Augusta, as the longest-serving member of the petitioning majority. She opened it with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a great deal to do and intended to do all of it correctly. She read the Wisengamot findings into the board record. 19 claims upheld. The pattern of sustained conduct. The specific findings on the ward placement, the letter, the memory modification attempt, the ministerial interference during proceedings. She read it in full without editorial comment, which was more devastating than any commentary would have been, because the findings spoke in the specific, undeniable language of things that had actually been ruled on by a legal body after full evidentiary hearing. Then she asked Petunia to speak. Petunia stood. She had not prepared a speech for this either. She had prepared for the Wisengamot because that required legal structure and sequencing. This was different. This was 9 people around a table who already knew what the findings said and who were here to make a decision about what they meant. "I want to tell you something that isn't in the legal record," she said. "Because the legal record tells you what happened and I want to tell you what it was like." She told them about the night Harry arrived. Not the legal version, the human version. Coming downstairs at 2 in the morning because she'd heard something on the step, and opening the door to find a baby in a basket with a note, and understanding in that moment that the thing she had been afraid of for 10 years had just arrived on her doorstep and was crying and needed feeding. She told them what it had been like to hold him, a baby she hadn't asked for, in a situation she hadn't been told about, with no preparation and no support and no information, and to make the choice she made, which was not the perfect choice and not the right choice in every particular but which was the only choice she had, to take him in. She told them about the years that followed. Not the hardest parts. The board didn't need to hear about the cupboard from her, they'd heard about it from Harry and from Fig, but the daily texture of it. The school meetings. The neighbors. The constant management of secrecy that she'd been required to maintain without anyone ever formalizing that requirement or explaining what it was protecting or giving her any tools to manage it. The isolation of knowing something enormous and being unable to speak of it to anyone. She told them about the accordion file. How it had started, a note in a diary, then 2 notes, then a folder, then the habit of it, the discipline of recording things because they were real and they mattered and the world was very good at making real things disappear if you didn't put them somewhere permanent. "I am not a wizard," she said. "I never wanted to be. I spent a very long time being afraid of what magic was and what it had taken from me, and I am not entirely over that, and I don't know if I ever will be entirely over it." She looked around the table. "But I am not afraid of your institutions. And I am not afraid of powerful people. And I am not afraid of this room." She paused. "What I am asking you to decide today is whether the person who was responsible for my family's situation for 17 years, who made decisions that affected our safety and our lives and our choices, repeatedly, over 2 decades, without ever once asking, should bear the consequence that your law says applies when someone in a position of institutional power does what he did." She looked at each of them in turn. "I think he should. Not because I want him to suffer. Because the consequence is what makes the law real. Without consequence, what I went through was just something that happened. With consequence, it was something that happened and that was wrong, and the difference between those 2 things is everything." She sat down. Augusta looked at the other 8 members. Discussion? The discussion lasted 90 minutes. Dumbledore's 3 board allies made their arguments. They were not bad arguments. They covered the extraordinary circumstances, the wartime context, Dumbledore's singular importance to the wizarding world, the severity of forfeiture as a consequence. One of them, a woman named Parkinson, not unkind, genuinely troubled, made the point that forfeiture had only been used twice in the last century, and both times the conduct in question had involved direct magical violence against Muggles rather than procedural violations, however sustained. Crail had prepared Petunia for this argument. She had thought about it and she answered it herself without being prompted. The 2 previous forfeitures involved direct violence, she said, because those were the cases that came to the board. No Muggle guardian has ever successfully brought a petition before, because no one ever told them they could. The law doesn't say forfeiture only applies to violence. The law says it applies to sustained, willful disregard for Muggle rights by someone in a position of institutional authority. The reason this is the first time it's been applied to procedural violations is that this is the first time the procedural violations have been this thoroughly documented and this fully adjudicated. She looked at Parkinson directly. The board is not being asked to expand the law. It's being asked to apply it. Parkinson was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, a small nod, not agreement exactly, but the acknowledgement that the point had landed. The vote took 6 minutes. Augusta called it formally, by name, around the table. 6 ayes. 3 noes. Clean, undeniable, and on the record. The Board of Governors of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry had voted to recommend magical forfeiture for Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The recommendation would go to the full Wisengamot for the final vote, which required a 2/3 majority. Augusta closed the session. She looked at Petunia across the table and gave her a single nod that meant several things at once, and Petunia gave one back. The Wisengamot forfeiture vote was not a hearing. It was a vote. It was scheduled for February 3rd and it was open to the public gallery, which meant the gallery was not merely full but had a queue outside the ministry telephone boxes that stretched around the corner and was reported, Crail told her, in both the Daily Prophet and the Quibbler, in opposite tones. Petunia arrived with Harry and Crail and Vernon, who had ironed his best shirt and wore it with the determined dignity of a man who was committing to something he didn't fully understand but had decided mattered. She was grateful for it in the specific way she was sometimes grateful for Vernon, not warmly, not easily, but genuinely. The Wisengamot chamber was at its fullest capacity. 51 members present, the full complement, something that hadn't happened, Crail murmured, since the Death Eater trials after Voldemort's first fall. Every seat in the gallery was taken. Ogden was at the bench with 6 colleagues, all of them in formal robes, and the atmosphere was the specific charged stillness of a room in which something irreversible was about to happen. Dumbledore was present. He sat in the respondent's position with Pharaoh beside him, and he looked, as he always looked, composed. But he was an older kind of composed now, not the serene unassailable composed of someone who had never been seriously challenged, but the still, deliberate composed of someone who had been challenged, found the ground under them less solid than they believed, and was holding themselves upright by will. He looked at Petunia once, when she took her seat. She met his eyes. He looked tired. Not in the ordinary way, in the deep, specific way of someone who had been carrying a version of themselves that had become too heavy to carry without noticing when the weight began, and who could now feel the weight because someone had finally named it. She looked away first, because she was done with him, not because she was afraid of him. Ogden read the Wisengamot's findings into the forfeiture record. He read the board recommendation. He read the relevant provisions of the law. Then he opened the floor for a final statement from both parties before the vote. Pharaoh spoke for 8 minutes. She was excellent. She acknowledged the findings, acknowledged the violations, made a final impassioned argument for proportionality, for mercy, for the recognition that the wizarding world's greatest servant had made grievous errors in the service of goals that were genuinely and consequentially good. It was the best version of the argument she had been making since December, and Petunia sat and listened to it and felt nothing shift. Not because it was wrong in every particular, it wasn't, but because it was asking the wrong question. It was asking whether Dumbledore deserved mercy. The question on the floor was whether the law applied. Crail stood for the petitioner. He spoke for 4 minutes. He said, essentially, one thing: the law was clear, the evidence was undeniable, the board had voted, the findings were 19 of 24 claims upheld after full evidentiary hearing by this body, and the Wisengamot's function in this proceeding was not to weigh Dumbledore's legacy but to determine whether the law that this body wrote and maintained applied to the person who had violated it. He sat down. Ogden looked at the chamber. Does the respondent wish to make a personal statement? A pause. A long one. Long enough that the gallery, which had been absolutely still, remained absolutely still in the specific way it remained still when it was waiting for something. Dumbledore stood. He was very tall. Even now, even in this room, there was the quality of scale about him, not physical exactly, but that other thing, the presence. He stood and he looked at the chamber and he was quiet for a moment that was different from the procedural pauses of the hearing. It was the quiet of someone choosing their words with the genuine weight of finality. I could explain, he said. I could explain every decision, every choice, every moment of the last 17 years in detail. I have explanations. Good ones, for the most part. He looked around the chamber. What I find I cannot do, today, is pretend that having explanations is the same as having been right. He paused. I believed in what I was doing. I believed so completely that I never seriously asked whether the people affected by my decisions had the right to refuse. The answer, as this body has correctly found, is that they did. He looked at the petitioner's table. He looked at Petunia. Mrs. Dursley. I owe you an apology that is worth considerably more than the one I gave you in a Paddington hotel room in October. I don't know if I'm capable of giving it, but I want you to know that I understand, now, today, fully, that what I did to you was real, and that it had consequences that I will spend the rest of my life knowing I caused. He stopped. He sat down. The room was silent for 10 full seconds. Then Ogden called the vote. It took 11 minutes. He called it by name, as the board had done, but the chamber held 51 members and the formality of the process at this scale had a different quality, a rolling accumulation, name by name, aye or nay, the slow architecture of a decision being built in public. The final count was 36 ayes. 15 noes. 36 was more than 2/3. 36 was decisive. Ogden set down his pen. The motion carries, he said. Magical forfeiture is granted. The ceremony will be conducted on the 21st of February at this location, in accordance with the ancient rite of severance. She asked Crail about the ceremony. He told her it was old, older than the Wisengamot itself, drawn from pre-ministry wizarding practice. It was public, conducted in an open space, with the full Wisengamot in attendance as witnesses. The magic was removed not by an external force but by the act of the magical community bearing witness to its removal, the communal acknowledgement that the person standing before them no longer held what they had held. It was, he said, irreversible in the most complete sense. The magic did not go elsewhere. It ceased to be attached to the person. It became something like what it had been before the person was born, distributed, ambient, part of the world. Does it hurt? She said. I don't know, he said. Nobody who's experienced it has described it publicly. The 2 previous cases, neither of them spoke about it. She thought about that for a moment. Is he allowed to have people there? Support? Crail looked at her. It's a public ceremony. Anyone can attend. She nodded. She did not say what she was thinking. The 21st of February was cold with the specific determination of late winter refusing to concede to spring. The ceremony was held in an open courtyard within the ministry complex, not a room, not the chamber, but outside, because the rite required open sky. This was, apparently, not negotiable. The Wizengamot was assembled in a wide semicircle. Ogden stood at the center with 4 senior justices. The gallery, such as it was in an outdoor space, was the crowd that had gathered beyond the formal attendance, 100 people, perhaps more, standing in the cold on the surrounding walkways and balconies. Dumbledore arrived with Pharaoh and 2 other people Petunia didn't recognize. He was wearing robes that were simpler than his usual ones, quieter, in a shade of dark blue rather than the elaborate colors she associated with him. He looked, she thought, like a man who had dressed for the occasion as though the occasion was a kind of ending, which it was. Petunia stood in the designated petitioner's position at the edge of the semicircle. Harry was beside her. Vernon was behind her, present and solid and not saying anything, which was the right instinct. Crail stood to her left. McGonagall was in the formal Wizengamot section in her capacity as a magical citizen with the right to witness. She and Petunia had not spoken since the sitting room in November, but when McGonagall arrived she met Petunia's eyes briefly and held them for a moment, and whatever passed between them in that moment was sufficient. The ceremony itself was not theatrical. This surprised Petunia, because she had expected, from a community that seemed to invest heavily in spectacle, something elaborate. But the rite of severance was almost plain. Ogden spoke the formal language of the proceeding. He named the violations. He named the finding. He named the board recommendation and the Wizengamot vote. He spoke in the old wizarding tongue for one passage, untranslated, not for the gallery but for the record, and then he said, in plain English, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The magical community, in its capacity as witness, separates from you the power you have held in trust. The moment that followed was brief and completely real. There was a sound, not loud, not dramatic, but specific, like the settling of something large into a new position. There was a light, also brief, that seemed to come from Dumbledore himself and then didn't anymore. And then it was done. The crowd was silent. Dumbledore stood in the courtyard. He was still. He was the same height, the same shape, wearing the same quiet dark blue robes. His hair was the same shade of white. His eyes, Petunia could see from where she stood, were open, and they were still very blue. But something was different. Something in the quality of the space around him had changed in the way that a room changed when a sound you'd stopped noticing finally stopped. The presence was gone. Not the person was still there. But the other thing, the quality of scale, the thing that had made the space he occupied feel different from the space around him, that was absent. He was a man. An old man, standing in the cold in a courtyard, with nothing around him that didn't belong to the ordinary world. He looked at Petunia. She walked toward him. She had decided to do this weeks ago and she had not changed her mind. Harry said, very quietly, "Aunt Petunia, it's all right," she said, and walked. She stopped when she was 3 feet from Dumbledore. Close enough to speak at normal volume. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and for a moment they were simply 2 people standing in the cold. "I want to say 2 things," she said. He waited. "The first is this." She held his gaze. "I did not do this to hurt you. I did it because the law said it was possible and because what happened deserved consequences, and those are the only reasons. If you spend whatever time you have left believing I was driven by hatred or grief or revenge, you'll be wrong, and I need you to know that." She paused. "What I felt was real, and it was anger, and the anger was correct. But this was not anger. This was process." He was listening with the complete attention of someone who had nothing left to deploy, no strategy, no charm, no armor of any kind. Just listening. "The second thing," she said, "is that Harry is going to be fine." She said it without sentimentality, without softness, in the flat declarative way she said things she knew to be true. He is going to be exactly fine. And it will be because he is who he is, and because the people around him love him, and because, despite everything, you gave him something to fight for, and he is the kind of person who fights. She held Dumbledore's eyes. I thought you should know that I believe that. I'm not saying it to comfort you. I'm saying it because it's true and because you clearly love him, even if your love was catastrophically bad at asking permission. Dumbledore looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were bright, not with magic, which was gone, but with something purely human, which was still entirely present. Thank you, he said quietly. She nodded once. She turned and walked back. Harry was watching her when she reached him. He had the complex expression again, the one she couldn't entirely read at a distance, and could now that she was close enough to see it, grief and relief and something else, something tentative, the expression of a person at the edge of something new that they don't quite have words for yet. Okay, he said. Yes, she said. He stood beside her and they both looked at the courtyard, where Dumbledore was walking away with Pharaoh and his companions, toward whatever came next for a man who had been the most powerful wizard in Britain and was now simply a man. The crowd was beginning to disperse. The Wizengamot members were filing inside. The cold was getting into her shoes in the way cold eventually got into everything, and Vernon had appeared at her side with the practical instinct of a man who had decided his function today was warmth and was executing it by being physically present. There's a cafe, he said, around the corner. I walked past it on the way here. It looked warm. She looked at her husband. Yes, she said. All right. She looked at Harry. He looked back at her. There was something that needed saying and neither of them was quite saying it, which was the most honest possible description of their entire relationship, the thing that was there, present and real, that had never had the right language. Come for tea, she said. Saturday. Come to the house for tea. Harry blinked. Just tea? Tea, she said. Maybe lunch. We'll see how we go. He smiled then. A real one, uncomplicated, the kind she had not seen on him often, not the rueful sharp smile of someone braced for something, but the straightforward smile of someone who was simply glad. Yeah, he said. Okay. She nodded and they walked out of the courtyard together, the three of them, plus Crail who appeared from the direction of the Wizengamot section looking like a man who had just watched 30 years of professional purpose arrive at its natural conclusion and was not sure what to do with his hands. Crail, she said. Mrs. Dursley. Thank you, she said. For all of it. He looked at her. He was not a man who received things gracefully, she had learned, but he received this one in the quiet, sufficient way of someone who knew what it meant. It was the best case I've ever built, he said. By some distance. Yes, she said. It was. They went to the cafe. It was warm, as Vernon had promised, with steamed-up windows and the smell of coffee and something baking. They took a table at the back, all four of them, Crail included, because he had earned it, and ordered tea and food that arrived in reasonable quantities and was simply, adequately good. Harry talked. He talked more than she had ever heard him talk in a single sitting, about school, about his friends, about a defense against the dark arts class that had gone in an unexpected direction that morning, about something funny that had happened in the Gryffindor common room that he started telling and then stopped halfway through because he said, with a slightly embarrassed look, that it probably required context. She asked for the context. He gave it. It was funny. Vernon, to his credit, listened with the effortful attention of a man learning a foreign language at 50, present, slightly lost, but committed. He asked two questions that were the wrong questions for the right reasons, and Harry answered them without impatience, which was its own kind of remarkable. Crail drank his coffee and was quiet in the companionable way of someone who understood that this particular table was for people who had earned the right to sit at it, and who was comfortable with being slightly peripheral to the reason. Petunia sat with her tea and her piece of cake and listened to Harry talk, and she thought about the accordion file, which was in Crail's archive now, not her wardrobe, not behind the shoebox, but properly filed, properly stored, part of a legal record that would not disappear. She thought about the fact that she did not have anything to plan next. The hearing was done. The vote was done. The ceremony was done. The future ahead of her did not, for the first time in a very long time, have a legal filing in it. It had Saturday. Tea with Harry. Maybe lunch. They'd see how they went. She thought about Lily, the real version, always the real version, and this time when she touched it, the bruise, the absence, the place where a person used to be, it was still tender, as it had always been and probably always would be. But underneath the tenderness there was something that hadn't been there before, the knowledge that she had done something. That she had taken 17 years of witnessing and turned it into consequence. That what had happened had been named, and documented, and ruled upon, and would be in the record of the wizarding world for as long as the record existed. That Lily's son was sitting across from her eating a piece of toast and smiling at something he'd remembered, and the people responsible for the conditions of his life had been made to answer for those conditions in the only language that institutions understood. It was not enough. Some things were never entirely enough. But it was real, and it was permanent, and it was more than there had been before. Harry looked up from his toast and caught her looking at him. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They had gotten, she thought, past the stage of needing to fill every silence, and into something earlier and simpler than that, something that was just the two of them at a table in the warm, with tea, which was ordinary and genuine and sufficient. Outside, London went about its enormous ordinary business, entirely unaware. Inside, 4 people sat around a table and ate breakfast and talked about nothing in particular, and the woman at the center of it all sat with her hands around a warm cup and let herself be, simply and without performance, exactly where she was. Which was here. Which was enough.